When the mogul Richard Hamilton decided to fake a coma to find out who truly loved him, he expected to uncover some uncomfortable family secrets. What he didn't expect was to hear his own family plotting his death while coldly discussing how to divide his $2 billion fortune. For 6 agonizing days, Richard lay motionless in his hospital bed, forced to listen to every betrayal, every lie, every cruel word from people he had trusted and loved his entire life. But when everyone around him revealed their true greedy and cruel nature, it was a stranger, a humble nurse from the Bronx, who whispered the words that changed everything forever. What she said not only awakened his consciousness but transformed a broken man into someone completely new. Because sometimes, when we lose everything, we finally discover who we really are.
Hello. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. At the end, please rate the story. I will be happy to respond to you in the comments. Now, let's get to the story.
The office on the top floor of the Hamilton Industries Tower was immersed in a golden twilight, only illuminated by the soft light of the late afternoon filtering through the enormous panoramic windows. Richard Hamilton was sitting behind his solid mahogany desk, his fingers nervously drumming on the polished surface as his eyes scanned the multiple computer screens in front of him. 43 years building this empire, he murmured to himself, his rough voice breaking the silence of the empty office. 43 years to find out that everyone around me are vultures waiting for my death. On the main screen, images from security cameras flickered in sequence: the entrance hall of his mansion in Manhattan, his son David's office, the meeting room where his wife Margaret often met with the family lawyer. Each frozen frame seemed to confirm his darkest suspicions. Richard leaned forward, his blue-gray eyes narrowing as he watched a recording from 3 days ago. Margaret was sitting in her private office, speaking on the phone with an expression he had never seen before, a mix of anxiety and determination that made his stomach churn. "I can't wait any longer," he could read on her lips through the silent image. "He's becoming increasingly suspicious. We need to act soon." A chill ran down his spine. Margaret, his wife of 22 years, the woman who had vowed to love him in sickness and in health, was conspiring against him. The sound of his own heavy breathing echoed in the silent office. With trembling hands, Richard switched to another camera. This time, it was David, his son, his supposed heir, the man who was supposed to carry on the Hamilton family legacy. David was in his office, gesturing animatedly as he spoke with a man Richard recognized as Jonathan Pierce, his own chief accountant. "How long do you think it will take?" David was asking, his voice captured by the high-tech audio system Richard had secretly installed in all the offices. "Considering his age and the stress he's been under lately," Jonathan replied, adjusting his glasses, "I would say a few months. Maybe even less if we can speed up the process." Richard felt his heart race. They were talking about his death as if it were a business deal, a transaction to be executed with cold efficiency. "A few months," he repeated to himself, bitterness tinging every word. "My own son can't even wait for me to die naturally." Hours passed like a fog of devastating revelations. Richard watched, horrified, as he uncovered the extent of the conspiracy against him. Margaret had contacted a slow-acting poison expert. David was preparing documents to take control of the company. Even Clara, his personal assistant for 15 years, was involved, providing information about his daily routine and eating habits. 15 years, Richard whispered, watching Clara hand an envelope to Margaret. 15 years of loyalty, and this is what I get. The betrayal was not just professional, it was deeply personal. Every person he had trusted, every relationship he thought was genuine, had turned out to be an elaborate facade. He felt like a man who had discovered that his entire life had been a lie. When the clock on the wall struck 10 at night, Richard finally stepped away from the screens. His mind, shaped by decades of ruthless business decisions, was already formulating a plan. If everyone wanted him dead, he would give them exactly that, but on his own terms. "If they want to kill me," he said to the empty office, his voice now firm with determination, "then I will die. But not in the way they expect." Richard opened a secret drawer in his desk and pulled out a detailed map of the Hamptons. His properties were marked in red, and he carefully studied each road, each curve, each isolated location where an accident could occur without witnesses. It needs to look convincing, he murmured, tracing routes with his finger. But it can't be fatal. At least, not immediately. His eyes fixed on a specific curve on Route 27, about 3 miles from his summer home. It was a secondary road, rarely patrolled at night, with dense trees on both sides that would provide the perfect cover for his plan. Richard spent the next 2 hours studying police patrol schedules, ambulance routes, and even the shifts of the nearest hospital. Every detail was meticulously planned, every variable considered. He hadn't built a business empire by being careless, and he wouldn't start now. Mount Sinai Hospital, he said, circling the name on the map. 20 minutes by ambulance from Route 27. Top-notch emergency department, intensive care unit with private rooms. The irony was not lost on him. Mount Sinai was the same hospital where Margaret had had her plastic surgery the previous year, where David had been treated after a skiing accident in his youth. It was familiar, it was comfortable, and more importantly, it was where he could control the variables of his own death. Richard stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city sprawling below him like a sea of lights. New York had been his life for nearly 6 decades, since he arrived here as an ambitious young man from the Midwest. Now, that same city felt like a gilded prison, filled with people who wished for his death. Tomorrow night, he decided, his breath slightly fogging the glass. Friday, 1 o'clock in the morning. Perfect. He returned to his desk and opened a special file on his computer detailed medical information about induced comas, medications that could simulate them, and techniques to maintain consciousness while appearing completely unconscious. Lorazepam combined with propofol, he read aloud. Administered in specific doses, it can create the appearance of a deep coma while keeping basic brain functions intact. Richard had hired a private doctor a few months ago, ostensibly for routine checkups, but in reality to obtain information about substances that could help him in delicate situations. Dr. Harrison had been surprisingly cooperative, especially after receiving a generous retainer. A single dose, administered just before the accident. Richard continued planning. It will last long enough to get to the hospital and be stabilized. After that, small daily doses to maintain the appearance. He opened another file detailed layouts of Mount Sinai Hospital, including floor plans of private rooms, security systems, and even nurse shift schedules. Information that had cost a fortune to obtain, but would now prove invaluable. Room 314, he decided, studying the layout. Private wing, limited access, monitoring systems I can control remotely if necessary. Richard spent the rest of the night refining every aspect of his plan. He mentally rehearsed every move, every word he would need to say, every reaction he would need to fake. By morning, when the sunlight began to filter through the windows, he was ready. Today is my last day as Richard Hamilton, the living man, he said to himself, adjusting his tie in the executive bathroom mirror. Tomorrow, I become a ghost, watching and listening as everyone celebrates my death. The day passed in a haze of normal activities. Meetings with executives, calls with investors, decisions about businesses that soon would no longer be his responsibility. Richard played his role perfectly, showing no signs that anything was different. Margaret dined with him that night, casually discussing her plans for the weekend, completely unaware that she was speaking to a man she believed would soon be a corpse. "You look tired, dear," she commented, delicately cutting her salmon. "Maybe you should consider taking a vacation." "Maybe," Richard replied, watching her carefully. "Permanent vacation." "Permanent?" Margaret laughed, not catching the underlying meaning. "You would never be able to stay away from business for that long." "You would be surprised," Richard said softly, "at what I am capable of doing." After dinner, Richard headed to his private garage. His collection of luxury cars was lined up like soldiers in formation, each representing a different era of his successful life. His eyes fixed on the Aston Martin DB11, sleek, powerful, and more importantly, built to withstand significant impact. "You're going to help me die tonight," he said to the car, running his hand over the smooth paint. "And then you're going to help me find out who really wants to see me dead." Richard checked his watch, 11:47 p.m. Time to begin the final phase of his plan. A drive to the Hamptons was eerily quiet, just the sound of the engine and the whisper of the wind through the trees. Richard had taken a carefully calculated dose of lorazepam 40 minutes earlier, and he could already feel its effects beginning a slight dulling of his senses, a gentle fogginess that would intensify over the next hour. Perfect timing, he murmured, checking his GPS. 17 minutes to Route 27. As he drove through the darkness, Richard felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in months, he was completely in control of his situation. Tomorrow, he would begin the most important performance of his life. The stretch of Route 27 was exactly as he remembered, dark, isolated, with dense trees that would provide perfect cover. Richard slowed his speed, scanning for the exact spot he had identified. There, he whispered, seeing the specific tree he had marked on his map. Time to die. Richard gripped the steering wheel tighter, calculating the exact angle and speed necessary to cause significant damage without being genuinely fatal. His 43 years of business experience had taught him that execution was everything. As the Aston Martin approached the tree, Richard felt the lorazepam beginning to affect his motor skills. Perfect. It would look exactly like a man who had fallen asleep at the wheel. The impact was tremendous. Metal crumpled, glass shattered, and Richard felt his body thrown forward into the airbag. Pain shot through his chest and arms, but it was controlled pain, calculated pain. He had succeeded. Now, he whispered through bloodied lips, the real game begins. Richard closed his eyes and allowed the drug to take full effect. By the time the ambulance arrived, finding him through the GPS tracker he had secretly activated, he was completely unconscious to all external appearances. "We've got a wealthy middle-aged male, extensive trauma, unresponsive," he heard dimly as the paramedics worked on him. "Looks like he fell asleep at the wheel." "Get him to Mount Sinai stat," another voice commanded. "This looks serious." As the ambulance sirens wailed through the night, Richard Hamilton began his journey into death, a death that would allow him to discover who truly wanted him dead, and why. His last conscious thought before entering his carefully orchestrated coma was simple: let the games begin. The sound of high heels echoing on the marble floor was the first sign that the vultures had begun to gather. Richard Hamilton, motionless in his hospital bed, felt his heart race as he heard familiar voices approaching down the corridor of the private wing of Mount Sinai Hospital. "Room 314. A female voice confirmed, and Richard immediately recognized the authoritative tone of Jennifer Hamilton, his sister-in-law. "The doctor said his condition is stable, but serious." Richard kept his eyes closed, every muscle in his body relaxed by medication, but his mind was completely alert. This was the first real test of his plan. Would he be able to maintain the charade convincingly enough to deceive even his own family? "Stable," repeated the deep voice of Marcus Hamilton, his younger brother. "Does that mean he will survive or that he will die slowly?" The casual coldness in Marcus's voice sent a shiver through Richard. The two brothers had maintained a tense relationship for years, but hearing Marcus speak about his possible death with such indifference was more painful than Richard had anticipated. "Marcus," Jennifer whispered, but there was no real reproach in her voice, just a reminder that others might be listening. "Let's go in and see how he is." The door to the room opened with a soft click, and Richard felt the presence of two bodies moving around his bed. Jennifer's expensive perfume, something French and floral, mingled with the scent of Marcus's aftershave, creating a combination that Richard associated with tense family gatherings and forced conversations. "My God!" Jennifer murmured, and Richard could imagine her carefully modulated expression of concern. "He looks so fragile." "Fragile?" Marcus let out a low, bitter laugh. "This is the man who destroyed 3 competing companies last year. Who showed not a shred of mercy when he had to lay off 400 employees. Fragile is not a word I would use to describe my brother." Richard felt a pang of pain, not physical, but emotional. It was true that he had made tough decisions in business, but hearing Marcus reduce him to nothing more than a cruel businessman was devastating. "But now he is here," Jennifer said, her voice taking on a more practical tone. And that changes everything for us. Yes, Marcus agreed, and Richard could hear the sound of a chair being pulled closer to the bed. It finally changes everything. The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Richard could feel both of their eyes on him, assessing, calculating. The monitoring machine continued its constant beep, the only sound in the room besides Richard's controlled breathing. Did you talk to Thompson about the legal situation? Marcus asked, his voice low but audible. Of course, Jennifer replied. He said that if Richard remains in a coma for more than 30 days, we can start the processes to take temporary control of the company. If he doesn't recover, well, the will is quite clear. Richard felt his throat tighten. They were discussing his death as if it were a minor inconvenience, an obstacle to be overcome in their plans to take over his business empire. 30 days, Marcus murmured. That gives us time to prepare everything. Reorganize priorities, maybe restructure some of the more controversial investments. Those low-income housing projects he was pushing, Jennifer added. I never understood why he insisted on wasting money on those lost causes. Richard felt a wave of indignation. Those affordable housing projects were one of his few attempts to give back to the community, to use his wealth for something genuinely meaningful. Hearing Jennifer dismiss them as lost causes was like a slap in the face. And the charity foundation, Marcus continued. $500 million in a foundation that basically gives money to people who don't even know how to manage it properly. We could reallocate those funds to more sensible investments, Jennifer agreed. Maybe some hedge funds, or that commercial development project in Brooklyn. Richard wanted to scream, wanted to get up and confront the two about their callousness. The charity foundation had been one of the most important projects of his life, something he had hoped would continue his legacy long after his death. Discovering that Marcus and Jennifer were already planning to dismantle it was heartbreaking. Of course, we'll have to be discreet, Marcus added. We don't want to seem like we're too eager to take control. Naturally, Jennifer agreed. We'll keep up the appropriate appearances. Regular visits, conversations with the doctors, maybe even some public tears if necessary. Jennifer's blatant cynicism made Richard feel physically sick. She was literally planning to perform grief to maintain appearances while secretly celebrating his incapacitation. The door to the room opened again, and Richard heard the sound of familiar footsteps, lighter, but determined. A female voice he hadn't heard in months broke the silence. How is he? Sarah. His estranged daughter, Sarah Hamilton Brooks, had arrived from Boston. Richard felt his heart race even more, a mix of hope and anxiety coursing through him. Perhaps Sarah, his own blood, would show some genuine concern. Sarah, Jennifer's voice was carefully neutral. We didn't expect you to come so quickly. Well, Sarah replied, and Richard could detect an edge of sarcasm in her tone. When your father is dying, you tend to reevaluate priorities. Dying? Marcus interrupted. The doctor said he is stable. Stable means he won't die today, Sarah shot back. It doesn't mean he will recover. And honestly, part of me wonders if he would want to recover. Richard felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. His own daughter was questioning whether he would want to live. What do you mean? Jennifer asked, curiosity evident in her voice. Look at him, Sarah said, and Richard could feel her gaze on his face. When was the last time any of you saw him genuinely happy? When was the last time he laughed, or showed any real emotion other than anger or disappointment? He was a busy man, Marcus defended, but even his voice lacked conviction. He was an empty man, Sarah corrected, hurt evident in every word. He spent so much time building his empire that he forgot how to build relationships with the people around him. Richard felt tears threatening to form behind his closed eyelids. Sarah's words cut deep because they contained a grain of truth that he had been avoiding for years. I spent my entire childhood trying to earn his attention, Sarah continued, her voice growing more emotional. Perfect grades, perfect behavior, perfect achievements. And you know what I got in return? Nods of approval and checks to pay for things that he was too busy to give me himself. Sarah, A new voice interjected, and Richard recognized the gentle tone of David Brooks, Sarah's husband. "Maybe this isn't the time or place to. When is the time, David?" Sarah interrupted. "When he's dead and buried? When it's too late for any of this to matter?" Richard could hear Sarah moving closer to his bed, her footsteps soft but deliberate. "I remember when Emma was born," Sarah said, her voice now barely above a whisper. "My first child, his first grandchild. I called him immediately, so excited to share the news. And you know what he said? 'That's nice, Sarah. Send me some photos when you get a chance. I'm in an important meeting right now.'" A sharp intake of breath from Jennifer suggested that even she was surprised by this revelation. "An important meeting," Sarah repeated, bitterness lacing every word. "My daughter was born, and he was in a meeting. He never asked about my labor, never asked if I was okay, never asked if Emma was healthy. Just send me some photos." Richard felt his heart breaking. He remembered that call, remembered dismissing it because he was indeed in a crucial negotiation. At the time, it had seemed like a reasonable prioritization. Now, hearing Sarah's pain, he realized how devastating his casual dismissal must have been. "And when Emma took her first steps," Sarah continued, "when she said her first word, when she started school, he missed all of it. Not because he was physically unable to be there, but because there was always something more important. Always another deal, another meeting, another opportunity that took precedence over his own family. People process grief differently," Marcus said, but his words sounded hollow even to himself. "This isn't grief," Sarah shot back. "This is a lifetime of accumulated disappointment. This is about a man who had everything: wealth, power, success, but who never learned how to love or be loved in return." Richard wanted to protest, to explain that everything he had done was to provide for his family, to build something lasting that they could all benefit from. But deep down, he knew that Sarah was right. He had prioritized building his empire over building relationships, and now he was paying a price. "I spent years in therapy," Sarah continued, "trying to understand why I never felt good enough, why I always felt like I was competing with his work for attention. And you know, a family that barely tolerates him, business associates who are probably already planning how to divide up his assets, and a lifetime of missed opportunities to connect with people who actually cared about him." The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of Richard's monitors. He could feel waves of pain radiating through his chest, not from his injuries, but from a crushing realization of how his family truly viewed him. "I'm not saying he was a bad person," Sarah said more softly. "I'm saying he was a lonely person who never learned how to be anything else. And maybe this is his way of escaping from a life that had become unbearable." "You think he crashed deliberately?" Marcus asked, shock evident in his voice. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But I know that he'd been different lately. More paranoid, more isolated. Like he was carrying some kind of weight that he couldn't share with anyone." Richard felt a chill run through him. Sarah had noticed his growing paranoia, his increasing isolation as he discovered a conspiracy against him. But she had interpreted it as depression rather than justified fear. "Maybe," Sarah concluded, "waking up would be more cruel than kind. Maybe he's finally found some peace." A silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts and emotions. Richard lay there, supposed to be unconscious, while his family basically discussed whether death might be preferable to his continuing existence. "Well," Jennifer finally said, her voice carefully controlled, "whatever happens, we need to make sure that his affairs are in order. For everyone's sake." "Agreed," Marcus added. "I'll work with the lawyers to start preparing necessary documents. Just in case. And I'll handle any media inquiries," Jennifer said. "We want to control a narrative if this becomes public." Richard listened in horrified amazement as his family coolly discussed managing his potential death, as if it were just another business transaction requiring careful handling. "I should probably stay in New York for a few days," Sarah said. "Just to see how things develop." "That would be wise," David agreed. Emma and Michael are old enough to understand that something's wrong with their grandfather. Are they? Sarah asked with painful honesty. They barely know him. He's more like a distant figure who sends expensive gifts on birthdays than an actual grandfather. Richard felt each word like a physical blow. His grandchildren, Emma now 12, Michael 10, were essentially strangers to him. He had missed so much of their lives, so many opportunities to build meaningful connections. I remember when Emma was about 5, Sarah continued. She asked me why Grandpa Richard never played with her like David's father did. I didn't know how to respond. How do you explain to a child that their grandfather doesn't know how to play, that he never learned how to simply enjoy being with family? Children are resilient, David offered weakly. Yes, they are, Sarah agreed. But they also understand more than we give them credit for. They know when someone doesn't really want to spend time with them. They can feel when interactions are forced or obligatory. Richard wanted to scream that it wasn't indifference, but rather his own discomfort with emotional intimacy. He had grown up in a household where affection was rarely expressed, where love was demonstrated through providing and protecting rather than through physical affection or quality time. Maybe this accident will be a wake-up call, Marcus suggested. If he recovers, maybe he'll want to change. People don't change at 58, Sarah replied with bitter certainty. Not when they've spent their entire adult life building walls around themselves. Not when they've perfected strategies for keeping people at arm's length. Sarah, David said gently, maybe you should consider that your father might have been afraid. Afraid? Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. Richard Hamilton, afraid? The man who took on corporate giants and won? The man who built an empire from nothing? Afraid of emotional vulnerability, David clarified. Afraid of being rejected, of being seen as weak, of losing control. Business deals have clear rules, clear outcomes. Relationships are messy and unpredictable. Richard felt a surge of gratitude toward his son-in-law. David had identified something that Richard himself had never fully acknowledged, that his emotional distance was rooted in fear rather than indifference. Maybe, Sarah said quietly. But fear isn't an excuse for hurting people you're supposed to love. No, David agreed. But it might be an explanation. And explanations can sometimes lead to forgiveness. Forgiveness requires acknowledgement, Sarah replied. And acknowledgement requires him to admit that he made mistakes, that he hurt people. Has he ever done that? Has he ever apologized for missing my childhood, for treating me like a business meeting rather than his daughter? A silence fell over the room as everyone contemplated Sarah's question. Richard knew the answer, and it filled him with shame. He had never apologized, never acknowledged a pain he had caused, never admitted that his priorities had been wrong. Well, Jennifer said finally, we'll have plenty of time to think about all of this. For now, we should focus on practical matters. Practical matters, Sarah repeated with disgust. Even now, when he's lying here unconscious, possibly dying, we're talking about practical matters instead of about who he was as a person. Because, Marcus replied with surprising honesty, we don't really know who he was as a person. We knew him as a businessman, as a provider, as an authority figure. But as a person? As a human being with fears and dreams and regrets? None of us really knew that Richard Hamilton. Richard felt tears finally escaping from his closed eyes, rolling down his cheeks. Marcus was right. He had spent so many years hiding behind his professional persona that even his own family didn't know who he really was underneath. Is he crying? Sarah asked suddenly, her voice sharp with concern. Richard felt a moment of panic. Had his emotional reaction given him away? It's probably just a physiological response, Jennifer said dismissively. Unconscious patients sometimes have involuntary reactions. But tears usually indicate some kind of emotional response, David observed. Maybe he can hear us. Then maybe, Sarah said, her voice growing softer. We should talk to him instead of about him. Richard felt Sarah's hand take his, her touch gentle but uncertain. Dad, she said, and for the first time in years, Her voice carried a note of tenderness. The sound of firm and determined footsteps in the hallway made Richard immediately recognize the approach of David Morrison. After 27 years as his personal attorney, Morrison had developed a distinctive walk, purposeful, unhurried, but relentless. It was the walk of a man who carried secrets, and knew exactly the weight of each one. "Sorry to interrupt." Morrison's deep voice echoed through the open door of room 314. "I hope this isn't an inappropriate time." Richard felt the tension in the air change instantly. Sarah had just held his hand, a moment of emotional connection that he had treasured, but now he could feel his daughter pulling away from the bed. "Morrison," Marcus replied, and Richard could detect a note of nervousness in his voice. "We didn't expect to see you until we knew more about the prognosis." "Unfortunately," Morrison said, the sound of his briefcase being placed on the floor reverberating through the room. "There are matters that cannot wait. Matters that Richard was discussing with me in the weeks leading up to the accident." The silence that followed was laden with apprehension. Richard could feel everyone's eyes in the room turning to Morrison, waiting for whatever bombshell he was about to drop. "Perhaps we should talk in private," Jennifer suggested, her voice carefully controlled. "Sarah, dear, maybe you and David could." "No," Sarah interrupted firmly. "If this concerns our father, then it concerns all of us. No more family secrets." Richard felt a surge of pride in his daughter. Even amid her pain and resentment, she was demanding transparency, a quality he wished he had demonstrated more during his life. "Very well," Morrison said, and Richard could imagine his attorney adjusting his glasses, a habit he had whenever he was about to deliver particularly difficult news. "But before we proceed, I need everyone to understand that what I am about to share is extremely confidential and potentially explosive." "Explosive?" David Brooks repeated, concern evident in his voice. "Richard had hired me to conduct a comprehensive investigation into all of you." The impact of these words was immediate and devastating. Richard could feel the temperature in the room drop, could sense bodies tensing, breathing becoming shallow. "An investigation into us?" Marcus asked, and for the first time, Richard detected genuine fear in his voice. "What kind of investigation?" "Financial forensics, primarily," Morrison explained, his professional tone doing nothing to soften the blow. Richard had become increasingly suspicious that someone close to him was embezzling funds, manipulating contracts, possibly even planning to permanently remove him from power. "That's ridiculous," Jennifer said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. Richard was becoming paranoid in his last years. Everyone could see that. "Paranoid?" Morrison's voice carried a hint of iron. "Mrs. Hamilton, paranoia implies irrational fear. Richard's concerns were based on concrete evidence." Richard felt his heart racing. Morrison was about to reveal everything, all the discoveries, all the evidence he had gathered about his family's betrayal. Part of him was thrilled that the truth would finally come out, but another part was terrified of how his family would react. "What kind of evidence?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Financial records showing unauthorized transfers, forged signatures on documents, contracts awarded to shell companies controlled by various family members and business associates. The list is extensive." "You're saying," Marcus said slowly, "that Richard thought we were stealing from him?" "I'm saying," Morrison corrected, "that Richard had proof that several people close to him were systematically defrauding him. To the tune of approximately $43 million over the past 2 years. A gasp from Sarah was audible. Even David Brooks, who had tried to remain neutral, cleared his throat in shock. $43 million? Jennifer's voice was strained. That's impossible. "I have all the documentation," Morrison continued relentlessly. "Bank records, email communications, recorded phone calls. Richard was building a comprehensive case." Richard remembered those long nights in his office, poring over financial records with Morrison's team of investigators. Each discovery had been like a knife twist, each piece of evidence confirming his worst suspicions about people he had trusted. "But surely," Marcus said, and Richard could hear desperation creeping into his voice. Even if some irregularities existed, they could be explained. Misunderstandings, accounting errors. Mr. Hamilton. Morrison's tone was ice cold. Forged signatures aren't accounting errors. Shell companies aren't misunderstandings. Recorded conversations discussing your brother's planned demise aren't administrative mistakes. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard felt like he was watching his family's carefully constructed facade crumble in real time. Recorded conversations? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Richard had installed advanced surveillance systems in all family and business properties over the past 6 months. Video, audio, digital communications, everything was monitored and recorded. My God, David whispered. He was spying on his own family. He was protecting himself, Morrison corrected. And given current circumstances, his precautions appear to have been justified. Richard could feel waves of shock and fear radiating from everyone in the room. His family was realizing that their conspiracy hadn't been as secret as they had believed. How much did he know? Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. Everything, Morrison replied simply. Who was involved, how much was stolen, when various plans were supposed to be executed. Richard had been building a case that would have resulted in serious criminal charges for everyone involved. Was? Jennifer caught the past tense immediately. Richard was planning to make major changes to his will, his business structure, and his family relationships. He was going to confront everyone involved, offer them a chance to return stolen funds and face reduced charges, or face a full criminal prosecution. But now, Marcus said, understanding starting to dawn. With Richard in a coma. No, Morrison finished. Those plans are in limbo. Although what? Sarah demanded. Richard had begun implementation of some changes before the accident. His will was already being rewritten. Several family members and business associates were going to be completely cut out of his estate. Richard remembered late-night sessions with Morrison, painstakingly going through each clause of his will, determining who had proven themselves trustworthy and who had betrayed him. It had been one of the most painful experiences of his life. Cut out completely? Jennifer's voice was strained to breaking point. Those involved in a fraud, yes. Richard was very clear. Anyone who had betrayed his trust would receive nothing. Not his estate, not his business interests, not even token amounts. But who was going to be cut out? Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew an answer. I cannot reveal specific details while Richard is alive, Morrison said carefully. But I can say that a number of people in this room would have been very disappointed. Richard felt a perverse satisfaction at hearing his family's growing panic. They had plotted against him, stolen from him, planned his death, and now they were discovering that their carefully laid plans might have been worthless. Dr. Morrison, Sarah said, her voice stronger now. Are you saying that my father suspected one of us was trying to kill him? I'm saying, Morrison replied, that Richard had evidence suggesting someone was slowly poisoning him. We had arranged for comprehensive medical testing after the accident, but… Poisoning? David Brooks interrupted. Are you serious? Hair samples, blood work, toxicology reports, all the evidence suggested that Richard was being systematically poisoned with slow-acting compounds that would eventually cause organ failure. Richard remembered a growing weakness, a fatigue that no amount of rest could cure, subtle changes in his health that he had initially attributed to stress. Morrison's investigation had revealed that his symptoms were consistent with chronic poisoning. Who? Marcus asked, his voice raw. Who was poisoning him? That information, Morrison said, was going to be revealed when Richard confronted everyone involved. Unfortunately, an accident occurred before that could happen. Some accident, Sarah said quietly. Dad suspects his family is stealing from him and trying to kill him, and then he conveniently crashes his car. Sarah, Jennifer said sharply. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, Sarah replied, that maybe Dad's accident wasn't an accident at all. Maybe he was running away from people who wanted him dead. Richard felt his heart break all over again. Sarah was so close to the truth. Our father is lying here unconscious, possibly dying, and you're worried about complications. Sarah, Jennifer said, you don't understand the full situation. If Richard wakes up with all this information, if he follows through on his plans, then guilty people will face consequences. Sarah finished. Is that what you're afraid of? That Dad will wake up and hold people accountable for their actions? Richard felt proud of Sarah's moral clarity, even as he realized that she still didn't understand that she was arguing with people who had actively planned his death. Dr. Morrison, Marcus said, ignoring Sarah's outburst. What happens to this information if Richard doesn't recover? That depends, Morrison replied carefully. Richard's instructions were very specific. If something happened to him before he could confront everyone involved, I was to turn all evidence over to federal authorities. Federal authorities? Jennifer's voice cracked. Fraud of this magnitude, involving multiple jurisdictions and potentially organized conspiracy, would definitely be a federal matter. The FBI would be very interested in Richard's findings. Richard could feel panic spreading through the room like wildfire. His family was realizing that their plans had been discovered, that evidence existed that could destroy them all. But, Morrison continued, Richard also left instructions that if his incapacitation was temporary, I should wait for him to recover before taking any action. How long? Marcus asked immediately. How long would you wait? Richard specified 60 days. Morrison replied. If he hasn't recovered sufficiently to make his own decisions within 60 days, I execute his final instructions. 60 days? David Brooks repeated quietly. Yes, Morrison confirmed. During which time, I am to monitor everyone involved and ensure that no further fraudulent activity occurs. Monitor? Jennifer asked nervously. Richard had extensive surveillance systems installed. They remain active. Every financial transaction, every communication, every action taken by anyone connected to his business or family is being recorded and analyzed. Richard felt a rush of satisfaction. Even in his orchestrated coma, his surveillance systems were still protecting him and gathering evidence. So essentially, Sarah said, understanding dawning, everyone suspected of fraud is now under constant observation for the next 60 days. Correct, Morrison confirmed. And any attempt to destroy evidence, flee jurisdiction, or continue criminal activity will be immediately reported to appropriate authorities. This is insane, Marcus said, pacing now. Richard has turned all of us into prisoners in our own lives. Only those who have something to hide, Morrison pointed out. Those who are innocent have nothing to fear from surveillance. But how do we know what evidence he thinks he has? Jennifer asked. How do we know what we're being accused of? You don't, Morrison replied simply. That was Richard's strategy. Keep everyone guessing, keep everyone nervous, prevent any coordination between conspirators. Richard admired Morrison's strategic thinking. By revealing the existence of evidence without revealing its specific contents, Morrison was creating maximum psychological pressure on everyone involved. Dr. Morrison, Sarah said, I need to ask you something directly. Do you believe my father's accident was really an accident? Morrison paused, considering his words carefully. I believe, he said finally, that Richard Hamilton was a man who had discovered that people he trusted were planning to kill him. I believe he was scared, paranoid about his safety, and possibly desperate. Whether his accident was truly accidental, well, that's something only Richard can answer. If he wakes up, Marcus added quietly. When he wakes up, Morrison corrected firmly. Richard Hamilton is one of the strongest people I've ever known. If anyone can survive this, it's him. Richard felt tears threatening again. Morrison's faith in his recovery was touching, especially since Morrison had no idea that Richard was already conscious and listening to every word. In the meantime, Morrison continued, I suggest that everyone involved take time to reflect on their actions over the past few years. When Richard recovers, he will be expecting answers, apologies, and restitution. Those who cooperate fully may find him more forgiving than those who continue to deny wrongdoing. And if he doesn't recover? Marcus asked. Then, Morrison said, his voice hard as steel, a federal investigation will proceed, and everyone involved will face the full weight of criminal prosecution. Richard made it very clear that if something happened to him, no one involved in a conspiracy should escape justice. Morrison picked up his briefcase, a sound sharp in a quiet room. I'll be checking on Richard's condition daily. And I'll be monitoring all of you closely. For your own sakes, I hope you'll use this time wisely. As Morrison's footsteps faded down a corridor, Richard lay in his bed, his mind racing with everything he had just learned. His family now knew that their conspiracy had been discovered, that evidence existed against them, that they were being watched. More importantly, they knew that they had limited time to figure out how to protect themselves. But what they didn't know was that Richard was conscious, aware, and listening to every word they spoke. Their next conversations would reveal their true intentions, their real plans, and their genuine feelings about his life or death. As silence settled over his hospital room, Richard prepared himself for whatever revelations would come next. His family thought they were discussing an unconscious man who might never wake up. Instead, they were confessing their crimes to their primary victim. A real game, Richard realized, was just beginning. The early morning at Mount Sinai Hospital carried that heavy stillness that only the first hours of the day can bring. Richard had spent the last 6 hours in a state of total alertness, his mind processing every devastating revelation that Morrison had dropped like bombs on his family. Now, in the apparent silence of room 314, he waited. He knew the conspirators would not be able to resist the need to gather, to plan their next move. The sound of cautious footsteps in the hallway confirmed his suspicions. It was almost 2 a.m, and Richard immediately recognized the familiar cadence of Marcus's footsteps, deliberate, yet trying to be silent. Soon after, the discreet click-clack of Jennifer's heels echoed against the cold marble floor. "Where is Thomas?" Jennifer's voice was an urgent whisper, yet still audible to Richard, who had learned to amplify his hearing during the long hours of feigned unconsciousness. "He said he would come," Marcus replied, his voice tense with anxiety. "We need to talk about what Morrison said today. About what we are going to do." Richard felt his heart race. Finally, they were going to reveal their true plans, their true intentions. Every fiber of his being was focused on capturing every word, every nuance of their voices. $43 million, Jennifer murmured, as if she still couldn't believe the number. "How did he find out everything?" "Those surveillance systems," Marcus replied bitterly. "That paranoid bastard has been spying on us for months." "Recordings, Marcus. He has recordings of our conversations." Richard remembered the nights he had personally installed some of the most sensitive equipment, his fingers trembling not from fear, but from deep sadness at realizing he had to spy on his own family to uncover the truth. "Here!" A third voice joined the conspiratorial whisper. Thomas Chin had arrived, his voice carrying that casual arrogance that always irritated Richard. "Sorry for the delay. I had to make sure no one was following me." "No one followed you?" Jennifer asked, incredulity tinging her voice. "Thomas, you're being paranoid." "Paranoid?" Thomas let out a low, bitter laugh. "Morrison said we are all being monitored. That the surveillance systems are still active. Paranoid is not the word I would use. I would say I'm being appropriately cautious." Richard felt a dark satisfaction. Their surveillance systems were indeed working, and Thomas was right to be nervous. Every word they were whispering was being recorded by the ultra-sensitive microphones he had installed in every corridor of this wing of the hospital. "We need to think clearly," Marcus said, taking on his natural role as leader. "Morrison gave us 60 days. 60 days before turning everything over to the federal authorities. Unless Richard wakes up," Jennifer added, her voice carrying a sinister implication that sent a chill down Richard's spine. "Exactly," Thomas agreed. "Unless he wakes up. And that, my friends, is something we cannot allow to happen." Thomas's words echoed in the hallway like a death sentence. Richard felt his throat tighten, even knowing he had control of the situation. Hearing his closest associates planning to keep him unconscious indefinitely was more devastating than he had anticipated. "Are you suggesting that?" Jennifer began, but couldn't finish the sentence. "I'm suggesting that we need to make sure Richard stays exactly where he is," Thomas said with a coldness that made Richard feel physically ill. "Unconscious, incapacitated, and legally incompetent to make decisions." "How?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. "Dr. Patricia Wells," Thomas replied immediately. "The doctor in charge of his case. She has some financial problems. Problems that a substantial amount of money could solve." Richard remembered Dr. Wells, a competent, professional woman who had until then shown genuine concern for his well-being. Discovering that Thomas was planning to corrupt his doctor added a new layer of horror to the situation. "You're talking about bribery," Marcus said, but there was no moral shock in his voice, only practical concern. "I'm talking about survival," Thomas corrected. "Morrison made it very clear that if Richard wakes up, we all go to prison. Not for a few months, Marcus. For years. Decades, perhaps. But if he doesn't wake up—" Jennifer left the sentence unfinished, allowing the implication to hang in the air like a toxic cloud. "If he doesn't wake up," Thomas continued, "then in 60 days Morrison hands over the evidence to the FBI. But then we can claim that any irregularity was the result of Richard's mental instability, his growing paranoia, his questionable decisions during his last months of competence." Richard felt a wave of indignation. They were planning to use his own discovery of their betrayals as evidence of mental instability. The audacity was breathtaking. "This could work," Marcus said slowly, considering the strategy. "If Richard is officially declared incompetent, mentally incapacitated, then any evidence he collected could be challenged in court." "Exactly," Thomas agreed. "And if he's in long-term care, sedated and unable to communicate, then he can't contradict our version of events." "But to do that," Jennifer said, "we would need more than just Dr. Wells. We would need legal documentation, guardianship proceedings, official medical statements." "I've already taken care of that," Jennifer replied, her voice taking on a businesslike tone that made Richard realize she had been planning this longer than he had imagined. "I have a judge who can fast-track the proceedings. The Honorable Walter Brennan of the Circuit's Court." "Brennan?" Marcus asked. "Isn't he known for his flexibility?" "He's known for his gambling addiction," Jennifer corrected. "And for his crushing debts. A generous donation to his re-election campaign, plus some immediate financial assistance, and he will become remarkably flexible." Richard felt his stomach twist. Jennifer was not just planning medical bribery, she had already identified and approached a corrupt judge to facilitate the legal process. The extent of her preparation was terrifying. "So what's the specific plan?" Marcus asked, his voice businesslike, as if they were planning a hostile takeover instead of conspiring to keep a family member in a permanent coma. "Dr. Wells declares Richard brain damaged beyond recovery," Thomas explained. "Permanent vegetative state. No possibility of meaningful recovery. She recommends transfer to a long-term care facility where he can receive appropriate care. And once he's in the facility," Jennifer continued, "we assume guardianship through Judge Brennan. Legal control over all medical and financial decisions. Including the level of medication," Thomas added significantly. "Facilities like that are known for keeping patients heavily sedated to make care more manageable." Richard realized they were planning to keep him drugged indefinitely, trapped in a synthetic coma, while they systematically dismantled his life's work. "How long would we have?" Marcus asked. "Years," Thomas replied. "Patients in long-term care can remain in vegetative states for decades. And during that time, as legal guardians, we would have complete control over his estate." "Complete control," Jennifer repeated, satisfaction evident in her voice. "We could liquidate assets, transfer funds, reorganize the company structure. Essentially, build our own version of his empire." "And if he dies during care?" Marcus asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Then," Thomas said, It's a tragic but natural consequence of his condition. No questions asked, no investigation necessary. His estate passes to the beneficiaries of his current will. Richard felt sick. They were discussing his death as if it were an inconvenience that might eventually resolve itself. There are risks, Jennifer pointed out. If Morrison becomes suspicious, if someone questions the medical diagnosis, if Richard somehow what? Thomas interrupted. Miraculously recovers? From a verified brain injury? With documented vegetative state confirmed by multiple medical professionals. Once we have official documentation, Marcus agreed, it becomes very difficult for anyone to challenge. Who's going to question multiple doctors, court orders, legal guardianship proceedings? Exactly, Thomas said. And remember, Morrison's evidence is only valid if Richard can testify to its authenticity. If Richard is permanently incapacitated, then Morrison's recordings become hearsay evidence collected by a paranoid man with declining mental faculties. Richard marveled at their thoroughness. They had thought through every angle, anticipated every challenge, planned for every contingency. Except one, they had no idea that their primary victim was listening to every word. When do we start? Marcus asked. Tomorrow morning, Thomas replied. I'll approach Dr. Wells during her morning rounds. If we can get Richard transferred to long-term care within 2 weeks, then we have 45 days to establish complete legal control before Morrison makes his move. 45 days to liquidate enough assets to disappear entirely if necessary, Marcus added. Richard felt a chill. They weren't just planning to control his empire, they were planning to potentially flee the country if their plan failed. Disappear? Jennifer asked, concern evident in her voice. Contingency planning, Marcus explained. If Morrison's evidence is strong enough to convince federal prosecutors, then we might need to consider alternative arrangements. Alternative arrangements, Thomas repeated. I like that euphemism. Yes, we should all be prepared for alternative arrangements. How much money are we talking about? Jennifer asked. Total available funds if we liquidate everything? Conservatively, Thomas said, approximately $800 million. Richard's portfolio is impressively diversified. Real estate, stocks, bonds, private equity, offshore accounts. 800 million, Marcus breathed. Divided 3 ways, that's enough for very comfortable alternative arrangements anywhere in the world. Richard felt his life's work being parceled out as if it were already theirs. Every dollar represented years of his labor, his sacrifice, his dedication. And they were discussing it as if it were pocket money. But first, Thomas said, we need to ensure that Richard remains exactly where he is. Permanently unconscious, permanently incapacitated, permanently unable to interfere with our plans. Dr. Wells will cooperate? Jennifer asked. She will, Thomas assured her. Her daughter needs surgery that her insurance won't cover. $150,000 cash, and she'll diagnose Richard with whatever condition we need. And then? Marcus asked. Then, Thomas said, we begin a process of systematically transferring assets while maintaining appearances of being grieving family members managing a tragic situation. Grieving family members, Jennifer repeated with bitter irony. We'll need to be convincing. We'll need to be perfect, Marcus corrected. Any suspicion, any inconsistency, any hint that we're not acting out of genuine concern for Richard's welfare, and Morrison will investigate further. Then we'll be perfect, Thomas said firmly. We'll visit regularly, consult with multiple doctors, seek second opinions, demonstrate every possible concern for Richard's recovery while privately ensuring that recovery never happens. Richard lay there, listening to his family and business partner plan his permanent incapacitation with a precision that would have impressed him if it hadn't been so horrifying. Every detail had been considered, every contingency planned, every risk assessed. One more thing, Jennifer said, her voice dropping even lower. Sarah. What about Sarah? Marcus asked. She's been asking questions, challenging our decisions, demanding transparency. If she becomes suspicious about Richard's condition, if she starts investigating medical decisions, then Sarah becomes a problem, Thomas finished. A problem that might need to be addressed. Addressed how? Marcus asked, but his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Sarah doesn't know about the embezzlement, Thomas pointed out. She doesn't know about the conspiracy. As far as she's concerned, her father had a car accident and is now unconscious. If she starts investigating, if she discovers the truth, she could expose everything, Jennifer realized. Or, Thomas said, she could become a victim of the same tragic circumstances that might eventually claim her father. Accidents happen, especially to people who investigate things they shouldn't. Richard felt pure terror shoot through him. They were talking about murdering his daughter. His own daughter, who had shown genuine concern for his welfare, who had demanded honesty from his family, who had been the only person in a hospital room to show real emotional connection to his suffering. That's extreme, Marcus said, but he didn't sound horrified, just cautious. Sometimes extreme measures are necessary, Thomas replied. Richard taught me that. Business success requires willingness to eliminate obstacles, regardless of personal sentiment. But Sarah is family, Jennifer pointed out. Sarah is a threat, Thomas corrected. And threats must be neutralized. Richard would understand that. In fact, Richard would probably approve of our pragmatic approach. Using his own business philosophy to justify murdering his daughter was perhaps the most twisted thing Richard had ever heard. He wanted to scream, to jump up from his bed, to confront them with the full force of his outrage. We'll monitor Sarah closely, Marcus decided. If she becomes a serious threat, then we'll consider alternative solutions. Alternative solutions, Thomas agreed. I'm beginning to like that phrase more and more. For now, Jennifer said, let's focus on the immediate problem. Dr. Wells, Judge Brennan, and Richard's permanent incapacitation. Once we have that secured, we can address any other issues that arise. Agreed, Marcus said. Thomas, you handle the medical corruption. Jennifer, you manage the legal arrangements. I'll coordinate overall strategy and maintain family appearances. And if someone questions our decisions? Jennifer asked. Then we remind them that we're doing what's best for Richard, Marcus replied. We're ensuring that he receives the best possible care for his condition. We're protecting his dignity, his privacy, and his estate during a tragic period. What loving family member could object to such careful consideration? Richard realized that they had constructed a perfect cover story. Every action they took could be justified as loving concern. Every decision could be explained as necessary protection. Anyone who questioned them would appear callous, greedy, or insensitive. When do we begin? Thomas asked. Tomorrow, Marcus replied. By this time tomorrow night, Dr. Wells should have provided a necessary diagnosis. Within a week, Richard should be transferred to long-term care. Within 2 weeks, we should have complete legal guardianship. Within a month, we should be well on our way to liquidating his assets. And within 60 days, Jennifer added, when Morrison turns over his evidence to federal authorities, we'll be prepared with a complete defense based on Richard's mental incapacity and our role as grieving family members trying to protect a brain-damaged relative. Perfect, Thomas said. Unless anyone has objections or concerns. A pause, then Marcus spoke. Just one concern. Are we all committed to this? Completely committed? Because once we start, there's no turning back. If any of us develops a guilty conscience, if anyone decides to confess or cooperate with authorities, then that person becomes a liability, Thomas finished. A liability that would need to be addressed with extreme prejudice. Understood, Jennifer said. Understood, Marcus agreed. Richard listened as his family and business partner essentially agreed to mutual assassination if anyone tried to back out of their conspiracy. They had moved beyond mere financial fraud into the territory of organized crime. The silence of the following morning in room 314 was laden with a different kind of tension. Richard had spent the entire night processing the horrific revelations he had overheard in the hallway, the plans for bribes, judicial corruption, and even the murder of his daughter. But now, as the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the blinds, he noticed familiar footsteps approaching his room. It was Sarah. Just Sarah. Her steps were different this time, slower, more deliberate, carrying a weight he hadn't noticed before. The sound of her low heels against the linoleum created an almost funereal rhythm that made his heart race with apprehension. "Good morning, Nurse Johnson." Sarah's voice echoed in the hallway, but there was something different in her tone. The warmth she had shown in previous days had been replaced by a cold, controlled formality. "Good morning, dear," the nurse replied, her maternal voice carrying genuine concern. "You're here early today." "I wanted to have a private moment with my father," Sarah explained, and Richard could detect a note of finality in her words. "To say goodbye properly." "Goodbye?" Nurse Johnson seemed surprised. "Are you going somewhere?" "No," Sarah replied quickly. "I mean, saying goodbye to the man I thought he was. Before we make the necessary decisions about his care." Richard felt a cold dread begin to spread through his chest. Sarah's words carried an ominous implication he couldn't ignore. "Of course, dear," the nurse said gently. "Take all the time you need. I'll be at the nurse's station if you need anything." Nurse Johnson's footsteps receded, leaving a father and daughter alone in room 314. But for the first time since Richard had begun his charade, he wished someone else were present. Something about the atmosphere Sarah had brought with her made him feel genuinely unsafe. "So," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a tone Richard had never heard before, cold, controlled, and laced with a bitterness that sent chills down his spine. "Here we are, Dad. Alone at last." She moved closer to his bed, and Richard could feel her presence but not the warmth he had felt during her previous visits. This time, she emanated something much darker, much more threatening. "The nurses think I'm here to have a touching moment with my dying father," Sarah continued, a hint of mockery in her voice. "They think I'm a devoted daughter, struggling with the possibility of losing a man who raised me, who loved me, who protected me." Richard felt his heart racing. There was something fundamentally wrong about Sarah's tone, about the way she was speaking. This wasn't grief or sadness he was hearing, this was something much more sinister. "But you and I know the truth, don't we?" Sarah said, moving even closer to his bed. "You know I'm not a devoted daughter. And I know you're not a loving father." The words hit Richard like physical blows. Whatever warmth and connection he had felt with Sarah during her previous visits was being systematically destroyed by each sentence she spoke. "I want you to know," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength and venom, "that if you can hear me, if you're somehow conscious inside that pathetic shell of a body, then you need to understand exactly who I really am." Richard wanted to scream, to move, to somehow interrupt what was clearly going to be a devastating revelation. But he was trapped in his self-imposed prison, forced to listen to whatever horror Sarah was about to reveal. "You destroyed my childhood," Sarah said, her voice becoming increasingly bitter. "Not through abuse or neglect, oh no, that would have been too simple. You destroyed it through your obsession with money, with control, with building your precious empire." Each word was delivered like a carefully aimed knife, designed to cause maximum emotional damage. Richard felt his carefully constructed image of himself as a protective father beginning to crumble. "Do you remember when I was 10? Sarah continued relentlessly. "When I asked you to come to my school play? You said you had an important business meeting. You always had an important business meeting." Richard did remember. He remembered many school plays, many recitals, many moments he had sacrificed for business obligations. At the time, it had seemed like necessary sacrifices to provide for his family's future. "Or when I was 15, Sarah pressed on. "And I wanted to apply to art school. You said art was a hobby, not a career. That I needed to focus on something practical, something that would contribute to the family business." A pain in Richard's chest was intensifying. He remembered that conversation, remembered his practical concerns about Sarah's future financial security. He had thought he was protecting her from uncertainty. Or when I was 21, Sarah continued, her voice rising with accumulated rage. And I wanted to marry David Patterson? You had him investigated. You discovered that his family had some financial difficulties, and you sabotaged our relationship. You destroyed the only man I ever truly loved. Richard felt physically sick. David Patterson had been Sarah's college boyfriend, a young man Richard had indeed investigated and found lacking in financial stability. He had arranged for certain information to be revealed that had ended Sarah's relationship, convincing himself that he was protecting her from future hardship. You want to know the truth about David? Sarah asked, her voice now filled with pure hatred. He wasn't after my money. He genuinely loved me. He wanted to build a life with me based on love, not wealth. And you destroyed that. You destroyed the only chance I had for genuine happiness. Tears were threatening to well up in Richard's eyes. He had convinced himself that his actions had been protective, paternal, necessary. But hearing Sarah's perspective was forcing him to confront a possibility that he had been wrong, that his control had been destructive rather than protective. But you want to know the really delicious irony? Sarah said, her voice now taking on a tone of cruel satisfaction. All those years you spent trying to control my life, to mold me into your perfect daughter, to make me into someone worthy of your empire, all those years, I was learning. Learning what? Richard wanted to scream, but he could only lie there and listen. Learning how to hate you, Sarah said simply. Learning how to resent everything you stood for. Learning how to plot against you. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. His daughter, his beloved daughter, had been plotting against him for years. You think that Marcus and Jennifer and Thomas are your only enemies? Sarah continued, her voice now filled with dark amusement. You think they're the only ones who have been working against you? Oh, Dad, you are so much more naive than you realize. Richard felt his world tilting. Sarah was part of a conspiracy. His daughter, whom he had tried to protect, whom he had loved despite her resentment, was actively working against him. I've been working with Marcus for almost 2 years, Sarah revealed, her voice matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather. Not because I care about his financial problems, not because I want a share of your money. Because I want to destroy you. The casual cruelty in her voice was more devastating than any physical torture could have been. Richard felt his heart breaking in ways he hadn't known were possible. You want to know how deep this goes? Sarah asked, moving even closer to his bed. I've already contacted buyers for your art collection. Your precious Picassos, your beloved Monets, your treasured Van Goghs, they're all going to be sold to private collectors who will keep them hidden from public view forever. Richard remembered his art collection as a source of genuine pride and joy. Each piece had been carefully selected, lovingly maintained, intended to be a legacy that would outlast his lifetime. And your real estate holdings? Sarah continued relentlessly. Your beautiful country estate in Connecticut? Your penthouse in Manhattan? Your cabin in Colorado? All of them are going to be sold to developers who will tear them down and build shopping malls. Each revelation was designed to hurt him in the most personal way possible. Sarah wasn't just attacking his wealth, she was attacking his memories, his experiences, his emotional connections to places that had meant something to him. But the most beautiful part, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than her previous volume, is that you're going to be alive to witness all of it. Richard felt terror shoot through him. She knew. Somehow, she knew that he was conscious. Oh yes, Sarah said, interpreting his silence correctly. I know that you can hear me. I know that you're conscious. I know that you staged this entire charade to try to discover who was betraying you. A revelation hit Richard like lightning. Sarah had known all along. Everything she had done, every emotion she had displayed, had been a performance. You think you're so clever, Sarah continued, her voice filled with contempt. Staging your own death, pretending to be comatose, listening to family secrets. But did it ever occur to you that maybe, just maybe, we know exactly what you're doing? Richard's mind. Had their corridor conversation been a performance for his benefit? The thing is, Sarah said, pulling a chair closer to his bed and sitting down, we've been playing this game much longer than you realize. We knew that you suspected something. We knew that you were investigating us. We knew that you were planning to change your will. She leaned forward, her voice becoming more intimate, more personal, more cruel. So we decided to let you discover exactly what you were looking for. We wanted you to find evidence of our conspiracy. We wanted you to realize that people close to you were betraying you. We wanted you to experience that pain. Richard felt like he was drowning. Nothing he had discovered was accidental. Every revelation had been carefully orchestrated to maximize his psychological suffering. But more importantly, Sarah continued, we wanted you to understand that your precious daughter, a child that you thought you were protecting, a girl that you believed still loved you despite everything, we wanted you to know that she hates you more than anyone else. Her words were like poison injected directly into his heart. Richard had endured financial betrayal, had faced conspiracy and theft, had accepted that his siblings and business partners were capable of murder. But discovering that his daughter's hatred was deliberate, calculated, and complete was beyond his ability to process. You destroyed my life, Sarah said, her voice now quiet but filled with an intensity that was terrifying. You took away my choices, my freedom, my chance for genuine love. You turned me into a possession, an asset to be managed rather than a person to be loved. Richard wanted to argue, to defend himself, to explain that everything he had done had been motivated by love and concern for her future. But even as he formed those thoughts, he began to question them. Had his actions really been about love, or had they been about control? And now, Sarah said, standing up from her chair, you're going to pay for all of it. You're going to remain conscious while we systematically destroy everything that you've built. You're going to watch as we liquidate your assets, sell your treasures, and eliminate any trace of your legacy. She began pacing beside his bed, her energy building as she described his coming torment. Dr. Wells is going to declare you permanently brain damaged, Sarah announced. She's going to recommend that you be transferred to a long-term care facility where you'll be kept heavily sedated. But not completely unconscious. Oh no, that would be too merciful. Richard felt pure terror. They were planning to trap him in a chemical twilight, aware but unable to communicate, forced to experience everything but powerless to respond. You'll be conscious enough to understand what's happening, Sarah continued, conscious enough to feel despair, conscious enough to experience loss, but not conscious enough to speak, to move, to fight back. It was a torture so sophisticated, so precisely calibrated to cause maximum suffering, that Richard couldn't believe his own daughter was describing it with such evident pleasure. And every day, Sarah said, stopping beside his bed and looking down at him with cold satisfaction, I'm going to visit you. I'm going to describe exactly how we're destroying everything that you loved. I'm going to tell you about each painting that gets sold, each building that gets torn down, each memory that gets erased. Her plan was to force him to witness a systematic destruction of his life's work while being unable to do anything about it. It was psychological torture refined to an art form. But a most beautiful part, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper again, is that to everyone else, I'll appear to be a devoted daughter. I'll cry at appropriate moments, I'll hold your hand during visiting hours, I'll consult with doctors about your condition. I'll be a picture of filial love and concern. Richard realized that Sarah had designed a perfect cover for her cruelty. She could torture him psychologically while appearing to be a loving daughter, ensuring that no one would ever suspect her true intentions. And if anyone questions our decisions, Sarah continued, if anyone suggests that maybe you deserve better care or more aggressive treatment, I'll remind them that I'm your daughter, that I know you better than anyone, that I'm only doing what's best for you. She had thought of everything. Every contingency, every possible challenge to her authority, every potential threat to her plan. The last thing I want you to know, Sarah said, leaning down close to his ear, is that all those years when you thought you were building a legacy, when you thought you were creating something meaningful that would outlast your lifetime, when you thought you were providing for your family's future all those years, you were actually building an instrument of your own destruction. Her breath was warm against his ear, but her words were colder than ice. Every dollar you earned, every asset you acquired, every connection you made, it's all going to be used against you. Your own success is going to fund your torment. Your own wealth is going to pay for your suffering. Richard felt like he was falling into a bottomless pit. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed for, everything he had believed in was being turned against him by his own daughter. I want you to think about that, Sarah said, straightening up and looking down at him with an expression of pure hatred. I want you to lie there in your fake coma and contemplate exactly how completely you've been defeated. Not just financially, not just professionally, but personally. By your own daughter. She moved toward a door, then paused and turned back. Oh, and Dad? Sarah said, her voice now casual, almost cheerful. I hope you can hear me. I hope you're conscious and aware and understanding every single word I'm saying. Because I want you to know, with absolute certainty, that I despise you. I hate you more than I've ever hated anyone. And I'm going to spend every day for the rest of your pathetic life making sure that you understand exactly how much. As Sarah's footsteps faded down a corridor, Richard lay in his bed, shattered completely. A conspiracy against him had been vast, sophisticated, and personal in ways that he had never imagined possible. But discovering that his beloved daughter was not only part of it, but was actually driving it had destroyed something fundamental in his ability to understand a world. For the first time since beginning his charade, Richard Hamilton genuinely wished that he were actually unconscious. A reality he had uncovered was more painful than anything he could have imagined. The afternoon of the third day brought a different energy to room 314. Richard was still processing the emotional devastation that Sarah had caused the previous morning, her poisonous words echoing in his mind like a symphony of betrayal. But now, the sound of multiple voices in the hallway announced a new phase in his psychological torture. Mr. Chen, are you sure it's appropriate to use the patient's room as an office? Nurse Johnson's voice carried a respectful hesitation, but she was clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Nurse Johnson. The familiar voice of Thomas Chen replied with that casual confidence that had always irritated Richard. Richard Hamilton has been my business partner for 15 years. These documents require your consultation, even in his current condition. We are simply trying to keep his business running during this tragic period. Richard recognized Thomas's mastery in manipulating situations. He was using the premise of loyalty and concern to justify what would clearly be a planning session to destroy everything Richard had built. I understand, the nurse replied, though her voice still carried doubt. But please keep the voices down. Other patients are resting. Of course, Thomas assured her. We will be very discreet and respectful. The nurse's footsteps faded away, and Richard immediately heard the sound of multiple people entering his room. Briefcases being opened, papers being shuffled, chairs being moved. The sound of a hostile takeover being orchestrated literally beside his bed. Gentlemen, Thomas said, his voice now dropping to a tone that Richard had never heard before, cold, calculating, and filled with a satisfaction that made him feel sick. Welcome to what I like to call ground zero of our new empire. This feels somewhat macabre, an unfamiliar voice said hesitantly. Planning a corporate takeover literally beside an unconscious man's bed. Unconscious man? Thomas repeated, and Richard could hear amusement in his voice. David, you're looking at this all wrong. You're not seeing an unconscious man, you're seeing an opportunity. A golden opportunity that we've been planning for 2 years. Richard felt his heart rate increase. 2 years. Thomas had been planning this betrayal for 2 years, long before Richard had suspected anything was wrong. 2 years? A second unfamiliar voice asked. You've been planning this for 2 years? David, Michael, Thomas said, and Richard could hear him settling into a chair. Let me explain exactly how we got to this beautiful moment. Because what you're about to witness is not just a hostile takeover, it's a masterpiece of long-term strategic planning. The casual pride in Thomas's voice was nauseating. Richard realized that he was about to hear a detailed confession of systematic betrayal spanning years of his life. Richard Hamilton, Thomas continued, built Hamilton Industries into a $2 billion empire through ruthless business practices, strategic manipulation, and absolute control over every aspect of his operation. He was brilliant, I'll give him that. But he made one critical mistake. What mistake? David asked. He trusted me, Thomas said simply, and Richard could hear him opening what sounded like a large briefcase. He gave me access to his client relationships, his financial records, his strategic plans, his deepest business secrets. He made me his confidant, his right-hand man, his heir apparent. Richard remembered promoting Thomas to Chief Operations Officer 5 years ago, remembered sharing confidential information with him, remembered treating him almost like a son. Every memory now felt like a dagger being twisted in his heart. But more importantly, Thomas continued, he underestimated my ambition. He thought that I was content to be his number two, to execute his vision, while he received all the credit. He never considered that I might have my own vision, my own plans, my own empire to build. So you decided to, what? Take over his company? Michael asked. Take over? Thomas laughed. Michael, you're thinking too small. I didn't decide to take over Richard's company. I decided to destroy Richard Hamilton and rebuild his empire as my own. Complete eradication of his legacy, followed by resurrection under my control. The calculated coldness in Thomas's voice was more chilling than anything Richard had heard from Marcus, Jennifer, or even Sarah. This wasn't just betrayal, this was personal annihilation planned and executed with scientific precision. Tell us about the 2-year plan, David said, and Richard could hear papers being shuffled as Thomas presumably opened files. Phase 1, Thomas began, his voice taking on a lecturing tone, was intelligence gathering. For 8 months, I systematically documented every aspect of Richard's business operations. Client relationships, financial vulnerabilities, strategic weaknesses, personal connections that could be exploited. Richard realized that Thomas had been studying him like a specimen, cataloging every aspect of his professional life for use as weapons against him. Phase 2, Thomas continued, was gradual undermining. I began making subtle changes to client relationships, planting seeds of doubt about Richard's stability, his decision-making, his long-term reliability. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would alert him to what was happening. How did you accomplish that? Michael asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Simple, Thomas replied. I would tell Client A that Richard was concerned about Client B's financial stability. I would suggest to Client C that Richard was considering reducing services for their account. I would hint to Client D that Richard was planning to retire soon and might not be able to maintain personal attention to their needs. Richard felt a growing sense of horror as he realized the scope of Thomas's manipulation. Every client relationship that had deteriorated over the past 2 years, every contract that had been cancelled, every business connection that had grown distant, it had all been Thomas's doing. Brilliant, David said admiringly. You made them doubt his commitment without ever directly criticizing him. Exactly, Thomas agreed. And because I was his trusted COO, his own right-hand man, they believed that I was sharing inside information out of concern for their interests. They never suspected that I was systematically destroying his reputation. What about Phase 3? Michael asked. Phase 3, Thomas said, his voice growing more excited, was preparation for transition. I began establishing my own relationships with key clients, positioning myself as a more stable, more reliable alternative to Richard's increasingly erratic behavior. Was his behavior actually erratic? David asked. Thomas paused for a moment, then laughed coldly. Define erratic. Richard suspected that something was wrong, that people were betraying him, that his business was being undermined. He became increasingly paranoid, increasingly controlling, increasingly desperate to maintain his grip on his empire. Richard realized that Thomas had created a perfect feedback loop. His systematic betrayal had caused Richard to become suspicious and defensive, which Thomas had then used as evidence of instability to justify further betrayal. So his paranoia was actually justified? Michael asked. Completely justified, Thomas confirmed. Richard Hamilton was absolutely right to be paranoid. People were betraying him, his business was being undermined, his empire was being systematically destroyed. But by the time he realized what was happening, it was too late to stop it. And Phase 4? David prompted. Phase 4, Thomas said, his voice now filled with triumph, was supposed to be a gradual assumption of control as Richard's influence waned. But then fate intervened and gave us a much more elegant solution. His car accident, Michael said. His car accident, Thomas confirmed. Which provided us with a perfect cover story for an immediate, complete takeover. Richard's brain injury, real or fabricated, gives us legal justification for assuming control of his assets while he's incapacitated. Richard felt a chill. Even Thomas wasn't certain whether his brain injury was real or part of a larger conspiracy. The complexity of the situation was beyond anything he had imagined. Now, Thomas continued, let's discuss the specific documents that we need to execute today. David, do you have the signature analysis that we discussed? Right here, David replied, and Richard could hear papers being unfolded. I've studied Richard Hamilton's signature on approximately 200 documents over the past 5 years. I can reproduce it perfectly, including natural variations that would occur in different circumstances. Richard realized that they were planning to forge his signature on legal documents. Thomas had brought professional forgers to his hospital room to execute fraudulent business transactions literally beside his unconscious body. Excellent, Thomas said. Michael, do you have the corporate restructuring documents? Most of them are actually relieved to have a more reliable option. Richard felt sick. His own clients' companies that he had served faithfully for years were being systematically stolen by his own business partner, and they were grateful for a betrayal. What about resistance? Thomas asked. Are any clients hesitating? 3 major accounts are expressing concern about breaking contracts, Michael reported. But once Richard is officially declared incompetent, they'll have legal grounds to terminate their agreements without penalty. And how soon will that happen? David asked. Dr. Wells has already been persuaded to provide a necessary medical assessment, Thomas explained. Richard will be declared permanently brain damaged within 48 hours. Legal incompetence proceedings will begin immediately after that. So by the end of next week, Michael said, you'll have complete control over a $2 billion empire. Complete control, Thomas repeated with satisfaction. And Richard Hamilton will be warehoused in a long-term care facility, probably drugged into oblivion, watching helplessly as his life's work becomes my legacy. A casual cruelty in Thomas's voice was staggering. Richard realized that his former partner wasn't just stealing his business, he was planning to torture him psychologically while doing it. There's one more thing, Thomas added, his voice dropping. I want to make sure that when Richard's condition stabilizes, when he's transferred to long-term care, that he's conscious enough to understand what's happening to him. Conscious enough? David asked. I want him to know, Thomas explained. That Thomas Chin, a man he trusted, a man he mentored, a man he treated like family, is the person who destroyed him. I want him to experience that betrayal completely. That seems unnecessarily cruel, Michael said hesitantly. Cruel? Thomas laughed. Michael, you don't understand. Richard Hamilton destroyed dozens of competitors over the years. He crushed small businesses, eliminated rivals, absorbed companies like a corporate vulture. He built his empire on other people's suffering. Richard felt a stab of recognition. Thomas wasn't wrong about his business practices. He had been ruthless, had destroyed competitors, had built his success on others' failures. So this isn't just about money, David realized. This is about revenge. This is about justice, Thomas corrected. Richard Hamilton is about to experience exactly what he put others through. Complete powerlessness, total loss of control, watching everything he built being taken away by someone more cunning, more ruthless, more deserving. And you're more deserving? Michael asked. I'm more deserving, Thomas said firmly. Because I understand something that Richard never did. power doesn't belong to a person who builds it, it belongs to a person who can take it and keep it. Richard built an empire, but he couldn't protect it. That makes him weak, and weakness deserves to be eliminated. Richard realized that Thomas had adopted his own philosophy and turned it against him. Every lesson that Richard had taught about business ruthlessness was being used as justification for his own destruction. "Let's begin," Thomas said, his voice now businesslike. "David, I need Richard's signature on these transfer documents. Make sure a forgery is perfect. These will be examined by federal regulators." "Already on it," David replied, and Richard could hear pens scratching against paper. "Michael," Thomas continued, "I want you to call our 17 confirmed clients and inform them that Hamilton Industries will be undergoing a smooth transition of leadership. Emphasize that all services will continue uninterrupted under my management." "What about the remaining employees?" Michael asked. "Layoffs begin next week," Thomas said casually. "Anyone who could be problematic, anyone who might question a transition, anyone who was particularly loyal to Richard. I want a clean slate." Richard realized that Thomas was planning to fire dozens of employees who had worked faithfully for Hamilton Industries for years. People with families, mortgages, children in school, all of them expendable in Thomas's quest for power. "How many people are we talking about?" David asked. "Approximately 60% of current staff," Thomas replied. "I'll keep essential personnel and bring in my own people to fill key positions. Within 6 months, Hamilton Industries will be completely transformed." "And what about the Hamilton Industries name?" Michael asked. "Gone," Thomas said with satisfaction. "Within a year, every trace of Richard Hamilton's legacy will be eliminated. New company name, new branding, new corporate identity. It will be as if Richard Hamilton never existed." A systematic erasure of his life's work was breathtaking in its cruelty. Richard realized that Thomas wasn't just stealing his company, he was planning to eliminate any evidence that Richard had ever built anything meaningful. "Are you sure about this approach?" David asked. "Completely eliminating his legacy seems like an unnecessary risk. Some clients might be uncomfortable with such a dramatic change." "David," Thomas said, his voice taking on a lecturing tone, "you're thinking like an accountant instead of a conqueror. This isn't about maintaining Richard's legacy, it's about destroying it so completely that no one will ever remember that it existed." "But why?" Michael asked. "Why not just take control and continue operating under an established Hamilton Industries brand?" "Because," Thomas explained, "every day that Richard Hamilton's name remains on this company is a day that reminds people that he built something valuable. I want to eliminate that reminder completely. I want to create a new reality where Thomas Jin is recognized as a brilliant businessman who saved a failing company, not as a man who stole someone else's success." Richard realized that Thomas was planning to rewrite history. Not just to steal his company, but to convince everyone that Richard had never deserved credit for building it in the first place. "The documents are ready," David announced. "Perfect forgeries of Richard Hamilton's signature on all key transfer papers." "Excellent," Thomas said. "Michael, do you have a corporate restructuring complete?" "All done," Michael confirmed. "As of tomorrow morning, you'll be CEO, chairman of the board, and majority shareholder of what will soon be Chin Industries." "Chin Industries?" Thomas repeated, savoring the words. "I like the sound of that." Richard felt his heart breaking. Not just because his company was being stolen, but because he realized that Thomas had been planning this murder of his legacy for years while pretending to be his loyal partner and trusted friend. "One final question," David said. "Are you absolutely certain that Richard Hamilton can't recover from his injuries? Because if he does wake up, if he regains consciousness, if he can challenge these transactions—" "He won't," Thomas said confidently. "Even if his brain injury isn't as severe as we're claiming, he'll be kept so heavily sedated that recovery will be impossible. And even if he somehow became lucid, who would believe him? A brain-damaged man claiming that his own business partner forged his signature? His own daughter supports our decisions, his own family members are involved in the planning. He has no credibility and no allies. And if he dies? Michael asked. Then we avoid a complication of long-term care costs, Thomas replied casually. His death would actually simplify things considerably. Clean inheritance, no ongoing medical obligations, no risk of unexpected recovery. Richard realized that Thomas was essentially expressing hope for his death. His former partner, a man he had trusted with his deepest business secrets, was casually discussing how much easier life would be if Richard simply died. I think we're done here, Thomas announced. Gentlemen, congratulations. You've just witnessed the birth of a new corporate empire. Within a week, Thomas Chin will control a $2 billion company. Within a month, Richard Hamilton will be forgotten. Within a year, no one will even remember that he ever existed. As Thomas and his associates began packing up their papers, Richard lay in his bed, completely devastated. The betrayal was so complete, so systematic, so personally vindictive that it exceeded even his worst fears about human nature. Oh, and gentlemen, Thomas said as they prepared to leave, if anyone asks, we were here to discuss Richard's medical care and comfort. We're concerned family friends trying to help during a difficult time. Richard listened as their footsteps faded down a corridor, leaving him alone with the knowledge that his business partner had just orchestrated a complete annihilation of his professional legacy, executed literally beside his unconscious body, and planned to continue torturing him psychologically for years to come. For a second time in as many days, Richard Hamilton genuinely wished that he were actually unconscious. The night of the fourth day brought a subtle yet significant change to the atmosphere of room 314. Richard had spent the last hours trying to process the devastating betrayal of Thomas Chin, the cruel words echoing in his mind like a mantra of destruction. But now, as the sun set over New York City, he heard different footsteps approaching softer, more careful, carrying a completely different energy from anything he had experienced since his charade began. Good evening, Mr. Hamilton, a female voice said gently, a voice he did not recognize but that immediately put him at ease. There was something fundamentally different in the tone, not the cold efficiency of the other nurses, not the false concern of his family, but something he hadn't heard in days, genuine warmth. My name is Maria Santos, she continued, and Richard could hear the sound of equipment being carefully adjusted. I will take care of you during the night shift. I know you can't respond, but I want you to know that I am here to make your night as comfortable as possible. Her accent was distinctly from the Bronx, with that musicality Richard had always associated with people who had grown up in neighborhoods where every word carried history and struggle. But there was something more in her voice, a kindness that seemed genuine, not performative like the artificial warmth he had received from his family. I'm just going to check your vital signs, Maria said, and Richard felt extremely gentle hands touching his pulse. Your hands are a bit cold, so I'll bring an extra blanket in a moment. It was the first time in days that someone had noticed his physical comfort. During all the visits from his family, all the whispered conspiracies, all the cruel plans discussed literally beside his bed, no one had cared if he was comfortable, if he needed adjustments, if there was anything that could be done to improve his condition. Let me adjust your position a bit, Maria said, and Richard felt skilled and careful hands moving his body. I know you probably can't feel much, but staying in the same position for too long can cause pressure sores, and I won't let that happen on my shift. The way she spoke to him was revolutionary in its simplicity. She wasn't talking about him, as his family had done. She wasn't talking over him, as the doctors had done. She was talking with him, as if he were a real person capable of hearing and understanding. Much better, Maria said after adjusting his position. Now you'll be able to breathe a little more easily. I know that when you can't move on your own, even small adjustments can make a huge difference. Richard realized she was right. The position she had chosen allowed him to breathe more deeply, relieve some pressure he hadn't even realized he was experiencing. It was a small gesture, but after days of physical discomfort that no one else had noticed or addressed, it felt like a profound act of compassion. You know, Maria continued, her voice taking on a more conversational tone, I've taken care of many patients in comas over the years, and I always talk to them. Some of my colleagues think it's silly, but I believe that even when you can't respond, you can still hear. You can still feel that someone cares." Her words hit Richard like a revelation. After days of feeling like he was spying on conversations, like he was an unwilling observer of his own destruction, Maria was talking to him as if he were a person deserving of respect and attention. "My abuela used to say," Maria continued, and Richard could hear her moving around the room, organizing supplies, "that a person's soul is never sleeping, even when their body is. She said that kindness always reaches a person, no matter how deep inside they might be hiding." Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in days: comfort. Not physical comfort, though Maria's adjustments had certainly helped, but emotional comfort. For the first time since beginning his charade, he wasn't feeling stressed, paranoid, or devastated. He was feeling cared for. "Today was a long day for you," Maria said, checking something on his foredrip. "I heard you had many visitors. Your family, your business partners. It must be overwhelming, all those people, all those conversations, even when you can't participate." If she only knew, Richard thought. If she knew exactly what those conversations had contained, she might understand that overwhelming was a dramatic understatement. "But now it's nighttime," Maria continued. "And nighttime is for resting, for healing, for letting your body and your mind find peace. I will make sure you have everything you need for a restful night." She moved away from his bed, and Richard heard her doing something near a window. A moment later, soft music began playing, not a harsh institutional sound, but something gentle and soothing. Classical music, something peaceful that seemed designed to promote healing rather than simply fill silence. "I brought my little radio," Maria explained. "I know some hospitals don't allow this, but I think music can be healing. My mother always told me that music touches a part of the soul that medicine can't reach." The mention of her mother seemed to bring a note of sadness into her voice, and Richard found himself wondering about this woman who was showing him such unexpected kindness. "You probably don't know much about me," Maria said, returning to his bedside, "but I've been a nurse for 12 years. I started when I was 22, right after my father died. He had cancer, and during his last months, I saw how much difference a compassionate nurse could make." Richard could hear a story unfolding, a personal revelation that felt completely different from all the other conversations that had taken place in his room. This wasn't about money, power, betrayal, or revenge. This was about a person sharing her humanity with someone she believed was suffering. "The nurses in this hospital," Maria continued, "they were professional, they were competent, but only one of them was truly kind. Nurse Patricia Rodriguez. She would sit with him when he couldn't sleep, she would adjust his pillows when he was uncomfortable, she would talk to him about his life, his family, his dreams." There was a warmth in Maria's voice that made Richard feel like he was being wrapped in a blanket of human compassion. "When he died," Maria said, "I decided that I wanted to be like Nurse Patricia. I wanted to be a person who made sure that no one in the hospital had to suffer alone, that no one had to feel like they were just a medical condition instead of a human being." Richard realized that Maria had chosen her profession based on a desire to provide comfort to others. After everything he had heard about greed, manipulation, and personal advancement, learning about someone who had built their career on compassion felt like discovering a different species of humanity. "It hasn't always been easy," Maria admitted, and Richard could hear her checking his monitoring equipment. "Hospital work is demanding, the pay isn't great, and sometimes you see things that break your heart. But when you can make a difference for someone, when you can provide comfort during a person's darkest moments, it makes everything worthwhile." She paused, and Richard heard her settling into a chair beside his bed. "I'm working double shifts this month," Maria said, her voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "My mother is sick, she has diabetes, and her medication costs are, well, they're more than we can really afford. So I've been picking up extra hours wherever I can find them." Richard felt a stab of recognition. Here was a person struggling financially, working extra hours to support a sick family member, yet she was still finding time to provide compassionate care to a patient she didn't even know. "The other nurses, they think I'm crazy," Maria continued. They say I should apply for positions in wealthier hospitals, in private practices where the pay is better. But I like working with patients who really need care, who don't have family members hovering over them with lawyers and accountants. If she only knew what Richard's family members were actually doing, he thought, she might understand that having family present wasn't always a blessing. Besides, Maria added, I've seen how people with money sometimes get treated in hospitals. Everyone wants to impress them, to make sure they're satisfied, to keep them happy. But sometimes, in all that attention to status and wealth, people forget to focus on what really matters, providing healing and comfort to a person who is suffering. Her words hit Richard with unexpected force. For most of his life, he had been accustomed to deferential treatment, to people trying to please him because of his wealth and power. But Maria was suggesting that such treatment might actually be less human, less compassionate than the simple kindness she was showing him. I remember a patient I had last year, Maria said. An elderly man named Robert Thompson. He was wealthy, had a beautiful private room, had doctors checking on him constantly. But he was also lonely, scared, and nobody was talking to him like a person. They were all too focused on managing his medical condition and satisfying his family's demands. Richard realized that Maria was describing exactly what he had been experiencing. Despite all the attention from doctors, family, and business associates, he had felt increasingly isolated and dehumanized. So I started sitting with him during my breaks, Maria continued. Not because I was required to, not because his family was paying extra, but because he needed someone to see him as a human being instead of a medical case. We talked about his childhood, his first job, his favorite movies. Simple things, but they made him feel like he was still a person worth knowing. What happened to him? Richard wanted to ask, but of course he couldn't. He recovered, Maria said, as if she had heard his unspoken question. Not completely, he still had health issues. But he recovered enough to go home, to spend time with his family, to enjoy simple pleasures again. And when he left, he told me that our conversations had been more important to his healing than any of the medical treatments. Richard felt a stirring of hope. If Maria could make such a difference to another patient, perhaps she could somehow make a difference to him, not physically, since he wasn't actually injured, but emotionally. Perhaps she could help him find some peace within a nightmare that his life had become. I don't know what your situation is, Maria said, adjusting his blanket again. I don't know if you can hear me, if you can understand what I'm saying. But I want you to know that during my shifts, you're not just a patient number. You're Mr. Richard Hamilton, you're a person with a life story, with experiences that matter, with dignity that deserves to be respected. For the first time in years, Richard felt seen. Not as a source of wealth to be exploited, not as a business target to be defeated, not as a pawn in someone else's game of power, but as a human being deserving of basic respect and care. I'm going to check on my other patients now, Maria said, standing up. But I'll be back in an hour to make sure you're comfortable. And if you need anything, even if you can't tell me, I'll try to notice. Sometimes caring for a person is about paying attention to things they can't express. As her footsteps faded down a corridor, Richard realized that Maria Santos had given him something that no one else had provided in days: hope. Not hope for revenge against his betrayers, not hope for recovering his lost fortune, but hope that human kindness still existed, that compassion was still possible, that even in his darkest moment, someone could care about his well-being without any agenda beyond basic human decency. For the first time since beginning his charade, Richard Hamilton found himself thinking about something other than betrayal and destruction. He found himself thinking about a young woman from the Bronx who worked double shifts to support her sick mother yet still found time to provide compassionate care to a stranger. And for the first time in years, Richard Hamilton felt grateful. The hours before dawn on the fifth day brought a deep stillness to the hospital. It was that sacred moment between night and day when the world seemed suspended in an almost mystical peace. Richard had spent the last hours in a state of contemplation he hadn't experienced in years, Maria's kind words echoing in his mind like a balm over wounds he didn't even know existed. The soft sound of familiar footsteps announced her return. During her last round, Maria had checked on her other patients with the same careful attention, but now she was coming back to him, and Richard could feel that there was something different about her presence and intensity, an emotional urgency that hadn't been there before. "Hi, Mr. Hamilton," Maria murmured, her voice even softer than before. "All the other patients are sleeping. It's just you and me now." Richard heard the sound of a chair being pulled closer to his bed, and then felt something that shocked him deeply, her hands gently touching his. Not the clinical check of vital signs he had received from other nurses, but a genuine human touch, full of warmth and intention. "I know this might seem strange," Maria said, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper, "but I feel like you're suffering in a way that goes beyond what the doctors can see. There's something in your presence, something that makes me think you're carrying a very deep pain." Her hands were small and calloused hands that had worked hard, that had known struggle, that had provided comfort to countless people. But they were also incredibly gentle, holding his hand as if he were something precious and fragile. "I don't know much about your life," Maria continued, "but I heard some of the nurses talking. They say you're a very successful businessman, that you have an enormous fortune, that you built an empire. But you know what I notice when I look at you?" Richard found himself hanging on every word, desperate to hear what she had observed that others had missed. "I notice that you look alone," Maria said simply. "Even with all the visitors you've had, even with all the attention you receive, there's something profoundly lonely about you. And I understand loneliness. I understand what it means to feel like no one really sees you, really knows you, really cares about who you are underneath it all." Her words hit him like a physical blow. For decades, Richard had been surrounded by people, employees, business partners, family members, social acquaintances, but Maria was right. He had been profoundly alone, isolated by his wealth, his power, his ruthless reputation. "When I was small," Maria continued, her thumb gently stroking his hand, "my family was very poor. We lived in a tiny apartment in the Bronx, and my mother worked 3 jobs just to keep food on our table. I remember feeling ashamed of our situation, ashamed that we couldn't afford the things that other kids had." Richard could hear a vulnerability in her voice that felt like a gift. She was sharing her deepest struggles with someone she believed couldn't respond, offering her own pain as a form of connection. "But my grandmother," Maria said, and Richard could hear a smile in her voice. "She taught me something that changed my whole perspective. She said that true wealth isn't about money or possessions. True wealth is about connection, about compassion, about being able to touch another person's heart and make them feel less alone in this world." Her words were creating something inside Richard that he hadn't felt in years, a stirring of emotion that went beyond anger, beyond fear, beyond a desperate need to control and dominate. It was something warmer, more human, more vulnerable. "I think," Maria continued, "that maybe you've been searching for something that money can't buy. Maybe you've been looking for acceptance, for love, for someone who could see past your success and your power and just appreciate who you are as a person." Her insight was devastating in its accuracy. For all his wealth, all his achievements, all his power, Richard had never felt truly accepted for who he was. People had loved his money, his influence, his ability to provide benefits for them. But had anyone ever loved him simply because he was Richard Hamilton, a person? "I want to tell you something," Maria said, her voice dropping to a whisper so soft that Richard had to strain to hear it. "Even though I don't know your whole story, even though I don't know what mistakes you might have made, what people you might have hurt, what choices you might regret." She paused, and Richard felt her squeeze his hand gently. "I still believe that there's goodness inside you. I believe that underneath all the layers of protection you've built, underneath all the walls you've created, there's still a person who deserves to be loved, who deserves to be forgiven, who deserves to find peace." Richard felt something breaking inside him, not a physical breaking, but an emotional cracking open that was both painful and liberating. For decades he had convinced himself that he was strong, that he was invulnerable, that he didn't need anyone's approval or acceptance. But Maria's words were reaching a part of him that he had buried so deep that he had forgotten it existed. "I know this might sound crazy," Maria continued, But I've learned to trust my instincts about people. And when I look at you, when I sit with you, I don't see a cold businessman or a calculating mogul. I see a person who is tired, who is hurt, who is carrying burdens that are too heavy for anyone to bear alone. She shifted in her chair, moving even closer to his bed. You know what breaks my heart? Maria asked, her voice filled with genuine sadness. It's thinking that you might have spent years believing that you're not worthy of love, that you're not worthy of compassion, that you're not worthy of forgiveness. Because everyone deserves those things. Everyone. Her words were washing over Richard like warm water, melting defenses that he had spent decades building. He realized that Maria was offering him something that no one ever had: unconditional acceptance. Not acceptance based on what he could provide, not acceptance contingent on his behavior, but acceptance of him as a flawed, struggling human being. I've seen this before, Maria said. Patients who've lived their whole lives trying to prove that they're strong, that they're in control, that they don't need anyone. But underneath all that strength, there's usually a person who just wants to be seen, to be understood, to be loved despite their imperfections. Richard felt tears welling up in his eyes, not tears of anger or frustration, but tears of something deeper. It was as if Maria was speaking directly to a part of his soul that had been dormant for decades, a part that had been waiting for someone to acknowledge its existence. I want to tell you something, Maria said, her voice now trembling with emotion. And I hope that somehow, somewhere inside, you can hear me and understand what I'm trying to say. She leaned closer to his bed, her voice dropping to a whisper so intimate that it felt like a prayer. Even if no one loves you for who you are, she said, each word carefully chosen and deeply felt, I believe that there is still a good man inside you. The words hit Richard like lightning, penetrating every defense, every wall, every barrier that he had constructed around his heart. For the first time in his adult life, someone was seeing him, not his wealth, not his power, not his reputation, but him, and declaring that he was worthy of love, worthy of compassion, worthy of redemption. I believe, Maria continued, that no matter what you've done, no matter what mistakes you've made, no matter how lost you might feel, there's still goodness in you. There's still a capacity for love, for kindness, for healing. And that part of you deserves to be nurtured, to be cherished, to be given a chance to grow. Richard felt something fundamental shifting inside him. For decades he had operated from a place of fear, anger, and a desperate need to control. But Maria's words were awakening something else, a possibility that he could be different, that he could change, that he could find a way to become a person worthy of the acceptance she was offering. I wish, Maria said, her voice breaking slightly, that you could hear me right now. I wish that you could understand that you're not alone, that you're not forgotten, that you're not beyond redemption. I wish that you could feel how much I care about your well-being, not because of anything you could do for me, but simply because you're a human being who deserves compassion. Her words were creating a revolution inside Richard's heart. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about revenge, about power, about control. He was thinking about possibility, a possibility that he could become a better person, that he could find peace, that he could experience genuine human connection. My shift will end soon, Maria said, and I don't know if I'll be assigned to care for you again. But before I leave, I want to make you a promise. I promise that no matter what happens, no matter where your healing journey takes you, I will remember you. I will remember this moment, this connection, this belief that there's still goodness in you waiting to be discovered. She squeezed his hand one more time, and Richard felt as if she was transferring some of her own strength, her own hope, her own faith directly into his body. Rest now, Maria whispered. Rest knowing that someone sees you, someone cares about you, someone believes in you. Rest knowing that you're not alone, that you're not forgotten, that you're not beyond love. As Maria's footsteps faded down a corridor, Richard Hamilton lay in his bed experiencing something he hadn't felt since childhood, a sense that he was lovable, that he was worthy, that he was deserving of care and compassion simply because he existed. For the first time in decades, Richard Hamilton wasn't fighting, wasn't scheming, wasn't plotting. He was simply being a human being who had been seen, acknowledged, and accepted by another human being who asked for nothing in return except a chance to offer kindness. And for the first time in his adult life, Richard Hamilton felt genuinely loved. The morning of the 6th day brought a sinister atmosphere to room 314. Richard could hear the familiar footsteps approaching, not the soft and careful walk of Maria, but the confident and determined sound of people who believed they were about to conclude a carefully orchestrated plan. "Good morning, Dad." Marcus's voice echoed in the room, carrying that false warmth that Richard now recognized as pure performance. "Today is an important day." "Yes," Jennifer added, her voice containing a note of barely contained excitement. "Dr. Wells brought all the papers we need to sign." Richard heard the sound of multiple footsteps entering the room, and then the professional voice of Dr. Wells. "As we discussed, Mr. Hamilton's condition shows no signs of improvement. Considering the extent of the neurological damage, I believe permanent care is the only responsible option. And that means—" Thomas Chen's voice cut through the air with that same cold efficiency that Richard had learned to despise, "that the legal arrangements we discussed can be implemented immediately." "Exactly." Sarah's voice joined the chorus, sounding almost giddy with anticipation. "We can finally move forward with all the plans we've been making." Richard felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through his body. This was the moment he had been waiting for. For 6 days he had listened to their betrayals, their greed, their complete lack of love or loyalty. Now it was time to reveal the truth. "Very well," Dr. Wells said, and Richard could hear papers rustling. "I need each of you to sign these documents. This will legally commit Mr. Hamilton to permanent institutional care and transfer all decision-making authority to his family." "Where exactly will he be transferred?" Marcus asked, and Richard could hear the barely contained eagerness in his voice. "Shady Oaks Extended Care Facility," Dr. Wells replied. "It's a discreet institution. Very private, very quiet. Perfect for someone in your father's condition." Richard almost laughed at the irony. They were so focused on their scheme that they hadn't even noticed that real security guards had been positioned outside his door for the past hour, men he had arranged through coded messages to his most trusted legal contact days ago, when he had first decided to end his charade. "And after he's transferred," Jennifer asked, "we can proceed with all the other arrangements?" "Absolutely," Thomas confirmed. "With Richard permanently incapacitated, we can restructure Hamilton Industries exactly as we discussed. The merger with Chin Corporation will proceed, and everyone will benefit significantly." "I can hardly believe that we're finally free," Sarah murmured, and Richard could hear the relief in her voice. "Free to live our lives without having to worry about his disapproval, his control, his impossible demands. He was never much of a father anyway," Marcus added with stunning callousness. "Always too busy with business to actually care about his family. Honestly, this arrangement is better for everyone." Richard felt his heart hammering in his chest. The time had come. After 6 days of listening to their betrayals, their greed, their complete lack of human decency, it was time to reveal the truth. But more than that, it was time to show them that Maria Santos had been right. There was still a good man inside him, and that good man deserved to be loved and respected, not betrayed and abandoned. "I just need everyone to sign here," Dr. Wells said, "and then we can proceed with the transfer." "Wait," Jennifer said suddenly, and Richard heard her moving closer to his bed. "Shouldn't we at least say goodbye to him? I mean, even if he can't hear us, it seems like the right thing to do." "Don't be sentimental," Thomas replied dismissively. "He's been unconscious for days. There's no point in empty gestures." "Thomas is right," Marcus agreed. "Let's just get this done." Richard Hamilton opened his eyes. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard could feel the shock radiating off each person in the room like a physical force. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head to look at each face: Marcus, Jennifer, Thomas, Sarah, Dr. Wells, watching as their expressions shifted from confidence to confusion to absolute terror. "Good morning," Richard said, his voice strong, clear, and carrying an authority that made everyone in the room step back involuntarily. I trust everyone slept well? Daddy. Marcus stammered, his face draining of all color. You're awake. I'm aware, Richard replied, sitting up slowly but with obvious strength. I'm very much aware. I've been aware for every single conversation, every single betrayal, every single moment of your pathetic conspiracy. Jennifer's hand flew to her mouth, and Richard could see the panic spreading across her features like wildfire. Richard, we thought, the doctors said. The doctors said what you wanted them to say. Richard interrupted, his gaze shifting to Dr. Wells, who was now backing toward the door. Isn't that right, Dr. Wells? Or should I say, Dr. Fraudulent Wells? Dr. Wells's face was ashen. Mr. Hamilton, I can explain. Oh, I'm sure you can, Richard said, standing up from his bed with the fluid motion of someone who had never been incapacitated. Just like you can explain your falsified medical reports, your deliberately misleading diagnoses, and your conspiracy to commit fraud. Richard, Thomas Chin interrupted, trying to regain his composure. You're obviously confused. You've been in a coma for nearly a week. I've been in a coma? Richard's voice was dangerously quiet. That's interesting, Thomas. Because I distinctly remember you saying, and I quote, the old fool would roll over in his grave if he knew what we were really planning. But since he's not going to wake up, we don't have to worry about his opinion. Thomas's face went white. You couldn't have heard. I heard every word, Richard continued, his voice gaining strength and authority. Every single betrayal, every cruel comment, every greedy scheme. I heard you, Thomas, talking about how you planned to destroy my company from within. I heard you, Marcus, calling me a burden that you couldn't wait to be rid of. Daddy, please. Sarah tried to interject, tears starting to stream down her face. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, Richard said, turning his full attention to his daughter. I understand that you said, and again I quote, when he's gone, we can finally sell this place and split the money. I'm tired of pretending to care about his boring business dinners and his pathetic attempts to be a father. Sarah's sobs were now audible throughout the room, but Richard felt no sympathy. These were tears of panic, not remorse. And you, Jennifer, Richard said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. You had some particularly interesting things to say about our marriage. Something about how you've been playing the dutiful wife for years and how you couldn't wait to finally be free to live your own life. Jennifer was shaking now, her carefully composed facade crumbling completely. Richard, I never meant. You never meant to be caught, Richard corrected. That's quite different from never meaning to say it. Dr. Wells was now edging toward the door, clearly planning an escape, but Richard's voice stopped him cold. Dr. Wells, I wouldn't try to leave if I were you. You see, I've had an interesting week to think about my legal options. And during that time, I arranged for some security measures to be put in place. As if summoned by his words, 2 security guards appeared in the doorway, real security guards, not hospital staff, wearing official badges and carrying handcuffs. Officers, Richard said calmly, I'd like to press charges against Dr. Wells for fraud, conspiracy, and falsification of medical records, and against Thomas Chin for conspiracy to commit fraud and attempted theft. What? Thomas shouted, his composure finally cracking completely. You can't do this. You have no proof. I have 6 days of recorded conversations, Richard replied smoothly. It's amazing what modern technology can do. Every word spoken in this room has been captured and documented. The security guards moved efficiently, placing handcuffs on both Dr. Wells and Thomas Chin while reading them their rights. The sound of the metal cuffs clicking into place was like music to Richard's ears. This is insane, Thomas shouted as he was being restrained. You can't do this to me. I'm a respected businessman. You're a criminal, Richard said coldly. And you're about to face the consequences of your actions. As Thomas and Dr. Wells were escorted out of the room, their protests echoing down the hallway, Richard turned his attention to his family members, who were now clustered together in absolute terror. No, Richard said, his voice carrying a finality that made everyone in the room tremble. "Let's discuss your futures." "Daddy, please," Marcus said, dropping to his knees beside Richard's bed. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean any of it. You mean your future with my money after I was conveniently disposed of?" "I love you," Jennifer cried desperately. "I've always loved you. I was just frightened. I wasn't thinking clearly." "You were thinking very clearly," Richard replied. "You were thinking about how to get rid of me while keeping access to my fortune. That's not love, Jennifer. That's calculation." "Daddy, please don't do this," Sarah sobbed, reaching out to touch his arm. "We're your family. We're all you have." Richard looked at his daughter, this woman who had spoken so callously about his death, who had shown no concern for his well-being, who had been prepared to abandon him permanently for financial gain. "You're not my family," he said quietly. "Family doesn't plot against each other. Family doesn't abandon each other. Family doesn't celebrate each other's destruction. We can change," Marcus pleaded desperately. "We can be better. We can be a real family." "It's too late for that," Richard said with finality. "As of today, you're all completely cut from my will. You'll receive nothing from my estate. You'll have no claim on my business, my properties, or my investments. You'll have to make your own way in the world." The sound of their combined sobs filled the room, but Richard felt no sympathy. These weren't tears of genuine remorse, they were tears of panic over lost financial security. "Please," Jennifer repeated, her voice breaking. "Please don't do this. I know I made mistakes, but I can change. I can be better. I can love you the way you deserve to be loved." "The way I deserve to be loved?" Richard repeated, and for the first time since awakening, his voice carried a note of genuine emotion. "Do you know what that means, Jennifer? Do any of you know what that means?" He looked at each of them in turn, seeing not family members but strangers who had revealed their true characters when they thought he couldn't hear them. "It means being loved for who you are, not what you can provide. It means being cared for when you're vulnerable, not abandoned when you're inconvenient. It means being treated with dignity and respect, not plotted against and betrayed." His words carried a weight that came from Maria's gentle whispers, from her genuine compassion, from her belief that there was still goodness inside him. "You had 6 days to show me love," Richard continued. 6 days when you thought I was helpless and vulnerable. Instead of showing compassion, you showed your true selves. You showed me exactly what I mean to you. We can make it up to you," Marcus begged one final time. "Please, Daddy. Please give us another chance." Richard looked at his son, this man who had called him a burden, who had celebrated his perceived incapacitation, who had shown no concern for his well-being. "There are no more chances," Richard said with absolute finality. "You've shown me who you really are. And I've seen enough." The room fell silent except for the sound of their desperate crying. Richard Hamilton stood over the ruins of his destroyed family, feeling not triumph but a profound sadness. These people could have loved him, could have cared for him, could have been a real family. Instead, they had chosen greed over love, betrayal over loyalty, cruelty over compassion. But as their pleas for forgiveness filled the air, Richard remembered Maria's gentle words, her belief that there was still goodness inside him. And he knew that while he would never forgive their betrayal, he would not let their cruelty destroy the possibility of finding real love, real compassion, real human connection. For the first time in years, Richard Hamilton was free. Free from false relationships, free from people who pretended to care about him, free to discover what genuine love actually meant. And as he listened to their desperate pleas falling on deaf ears, Richard Hamilton began to plan not revenge, but redemption. 3 months later, Richard Hamilton's life had transformed in ways he could never have imagined. The man who once ruled his business empire through fear and intimidation now walked the bright corridors of a completely different office, the Hamilton Foundation for Community Healthcare, located on the 22nd floor of a building in Manhattan that he had specifically purchased for this new purpose. The austere and intimidating decor that once characterized his corporate environments had vanished. In its place, walls painted in soft shades of blue and green created a welcoming and warm atmosphere. Lush plants occupied strategic corners, and photographs of smiling families beneficiaries of the Foundation's programs adorned the walls with radiant faces of hope and gratitude. "Mr. Hamilton." The familiar voice of Maria Santos echoed through the office, now carrying a confidence and authority that hadn't existed during those lonely nights in the hospital. "The reports from the pilot programs in the Bronx have arrived. The results are even better than we expected." Richard turned to see Maria walking toward him, wearing a stylish navy blazer that perfectly complemented her new position as executive director of the Foundation. Her hair was pulled back in a professional bun, but her eyes retained that same warmth and compassion that had touched his heart during his most vulnerable moments. "Maria," Richard said, and there was still a note of wonder in his voice whenever he spoke to her, as if he couldn't quite believe that this extraordinary woman had entered his life. "Please tell me about the results. And please call me Richard. We've long since passed that formal point." Maria smiled that genuine smile that had been the first real thing Richard had experienced in decades. "All right, Richard. The numbers are incredible. The mobile healthcare program we implemented managed to reach over 500 families in the first month. Many of these people had never had access to basic medical care before our intervention." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the meaning of those words. 500 families. 500 chances for life, for health, for hope. Throughout his career, he had measured success in dollars, in market share, in power accumulated. Now, he was learning a new metric: lives touched, people helped, suffering diminished. "And the doctors and nurses we hired?" Richard asked, genuine interest alive in his voice. "Are they happy with the program?" "More than happy," Maria replied, settling into a chair across from his desk. "Dr. Rodriguez told me it's the most rewarding work she's ever done. She grew up in the Bronx, and now she's providing care for children who remind her of herself when she was little." Richard nodded, feeling a deep satisfaction that was completely different from any pleasure he had derived from business victories. This was something purer, something that came from knowing that his resources were being used to genuinely improve people's lives. "You know," Richard said, his voice becoming more personal, "I never thought I would be able to find satisfaction in something like this. For decades I thought power and control were the only things that mattered. But working with you, seeing what we can accomplish together, it's shown me a completely different way of living." Maria's expression softened, and Richard could see that same compassion that had reached him during those dark hospital nights. "You always had that capacity inside you, Richard. You just needed someone to help you remember it." "No," Richard said firmly. "I needed you to show me what genuine care looks like. During all those years, I had forgotten what it meant to truly connect with another person, to care about their well-being without expecting anything in return." During the 3 months since leaving the hospital, Richard had transformed not just his business practices, but his entire approach to human relationships. He had learned to listen, truly listen when people spoke to him. He had discovered a joy in mentoring young employees, in supporting their dreams and ambitions instead of exploiting their efforts for his own gain. "Speaking of connection," Maria said, "are you ready for tonight's launch event? I know public speaking hasn't been your favorite thing lately." Richard smiled, remembering how terrified he had been of his first public appearance after his hospital experience. The old Richard Hamilton had commanded rooms through intimidation and authority. This new version of himself was learning to connect through vulnerability and authenticity. "I'm ready," he said confidently. "For the first time in my life, I have something real to say. Something that comes from my heart instead of my head." As evening approached, the Metropolitan Museum of Art's spacious hall filled with hundreds of people, healthcare workers, community leaders, philanthropists, and families from the communities that the Foundation was serving. Richard had insisted that the event not be an exclusive gala for wealthy donors, but a true celebration that included the people whose lives were being directly impacted. Maria stood beside him backstage, adjusting his tie with a gentle touch that reminded him of her caring hands during those transformative hospital nights. "Remember," she said softly, "just speak from your heart. Tell them why this matters to you. Richard took a deep breath, feeling a nervousness that was completely different from the anxiety he had experienced in high-stakes business meetings. This wasn't about winning or losing, about profit or loss. This was about sharing a truth that had changed his life. Ladies and gentlemen, the Master of Ceremonies announced, please welcome Richard Hamilton, founder and chairman of the Hamilton Foundation for Community Healthcare. Richard walked onto the stage, looking out at a diverse crowd that represented more than he had ever accomplished in his corporate career. In the front row, he could see Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman from Brooklyn whose diabetes medication was now being provided through their pharmacy program. Next to her sat Dr. Martinez, a young pediatrician who had joined their mobile clinic team. Throughout the audience, Richard could see faces that represented hope, opportunity, and genuine human connection. Good evening, Richard began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. 3 months ago, I was in a very different place in my life. I thought I knew what success meant. I thought I understood what power was. I thought I had figured out how to navigate this world. He paused, allowing his gaze to sweep across the audience, connecting with individual faces instead of speaking to an anonymous crowd. I was wrong about all of it. Richard continued. I had built an empire, accumulated a fortune, and surrounded myself with people who told me what I wanted to hear. But I had completely lost touch with what it means to be human, what it means to truly care about other people. In the audience, Richard could see people leaning forward, engaged not just with his words but with a genuine emotion behind them. This was something new for him, speaking from vulnerability instead of strength, from humility instead of arrogance. During a period when I was facing a serious health challenge, Richard said, choosing his words carefully, I discovered something that changed everything. I discovered that true wealth isn't measured in dollars or possessions. True wealth is measured in connections, in compassion, in the ability to make other people's lives better. He looked directly at Maria, who was standing in the wings, her eyes filled with pride and encouragement. During those difficult days, Richard continued, most of the people in my life showed me their worst. They showed me greed, betrayal, and a complete lack of genuine care. But in the midst of all that darkness, one person, a stranger, showed me something different. She showed me kindness without expectation, compassion without judgment, and care without condition. Maria's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy, not sadness. She had watched Richard transform from a broken, angry man into someone who could speak openly about love and healing. When everyone showed their worst, Richard said, his voice carrying across a silent room, it was a stranger who reminded me of who I was. The audience erupted in applause, but Richard could see that it wasn't polite charity gala clapping. This was genuine appreciation for a story of transformation, for a message of hope, for a reminder that people could change. That stranger, Richard continued when the applause subsided, taught me that everyone deserves compassion, that everyone deserves care, that everyone deserves to be seen and valued for who they are. And now, through this foundation, we're trying to extend that same compassion to thousands of people who need it most. Richard went on to describe the foundation's programs, but more importantly, he spoke about the philosophy behind them. He talked about dignity, about respect, about treating every person regardless of their economic status as a human being worthy of care and attention. We're not just providing healthcare, Richard explained. We're providing hope. We're providing connection. We're providing a message that every life matters, that every person deserves to be cared for, that no one should have to suffer alone. As he concluded his speech, Richard felt a sense of completion that he had never experienced in any business achievement. This wasn't about personal success. This was about being part of something larger, something meaningful, something that would outlast any corporate empire. A camera positioned at the back of a room slowly pulled back, capturing a final image that would become iconic. Richard Hamilton standing confidently on stage, but not alone. In the wings, Maria Santos watched with pride, her presence a reminder that transformation was possible, that genuine connection could heal even the most broken hearts. After the event, Richard and Maria found themselves back in their foundation office, working side by side on plans for expanding their programs. A warm light from a desk lamp created an intimate atmosphere that felt like home in a way that Richard's mansion never had. "You know," Maria said, looking up from a stack of grant applications, "when I first met you in that hospital room, I never imagined that we'd be here today." "Honestly," Richard replied, "when you first started talking to me during those nights, I thought you were just a kind nurse doing her job. I had no idea that you were actually saving my life." "We saved each other," Maria said simply. "You gave me an opportunity to make a difference on a scale I never dreamed possible. And I just reminded you of who you always were underneath all that armor." Richard looked at Maria, this extraordinary woman who had seen past his wealth, his power, his reputation, to recognize a human being who desperately needed compassion. Their relationship had evolved into something deeper than romance, deeper than business partnership. It was a friendship based on mutual respect, shared purpose, and genuine care for each other's well-being. "You know what the best part is?" Richard said, returning to his paperwork but continuing the conversation. "Every day, I wake up excited to come to work. Not because of what I can take or what I can win, but because of what we can give, what we can build together. And the people we can help," Maria added, smiling as she reviewed a thank you letter from a family whose infant had received life-saving care through their program. Outside their office windows, the lights of Manhattan twinkled like stars, but inside, Richard Hamilton and Maria Santos continued working quietly, two people who had found their purpose in serving others, who had discovered that true success was measured not in personal achievement but in human connection. For the first time in his life, Richard Hamilton was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do, with exactly the right person by his side. And as they worked together into the night, planning ways to extend compassion to those who needed it most, both Richard and Maria knew that they had found something that no amount of money could buy: genuine purpose, authentic connection, and a love that came from caring for others together. A foundation was more than a business venture. It was a testament to the transformative power of human compassion, and proof that even the most damaged hearts could be healed when touched by genuine care.
If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will also move you. Click to keep watching.